When Evelyn Moore signed her name on that marriage certificate, the whole town called her desperate, foolish. A woman throwing her life away for a man who looked like he couldn't afford his own boots. But what no one knew, what even Evelyn couldn't have imagined, was that the quiet, poorly dressed cowboy who bought her freedom owned more land than most men ever dreamed of seeing. This is the story of a woman who married survival and discovered she'd claimed an empire. If you stay until the end, you'll see how one impossible choice changed everything. Hit that like button and comment your city below. I want to see how far this story travels tonight. The coffin maker's hammer echoed through the morning like a death knell. Evelyn Moore stood at the window of her family's cabin, watching old Mr. Hendricks work in his yard across the muddy road. Each strike of metal against wood sent a tremor through her chest. He was building her father's coffin. Everyone in Ridgecrest knew it. The whole dying settlement had been waiting for Thomas Moore to take his last breath for nearly 2 weeks now. She pressed her palm flat against the cold glass, feeling the draft seep through the cracks in the frame. February in the Colorado high country showed no mercy. Snow piled against the cabin walls in drifts that reached the windowsills. The fire in the hearth behind her struggled against the chill, its flames weak and stuttering from the damp wood she'd managed to gather yesterday. Inside the small bedroom behind her, her father coughed, a wet, rattling sound that had become as familiar as her own heartbeat these past months. Each cough stole something from him. Each night, she wondered if morning would find him still breathing. Evelyn. Her mother's voice came from the bedroom doorway, thin and exhausted. Martha Moore had aged a decade in the span of one winter. Her hair, once a rich auburn like Evelyn's own, had gone gray at the temples. Her hands trembled constantly now, whether from cold or grief. Evelyn could no longer tell. "He's asking for you." Evelyn turned from the window. She didn't need to be told what her father wanted to discuss. They'd had the same conversation every day for a week now. The debt, the land, the impossible arithmetic of their survival. She crossed the small main room, ducking under the dried herbs hanging from the ceiling beams. Rosemary and sage her mother had gathered last autumn, back when hope still seemed reasonable. The floorboards creaked beneath her boots, loose nails protesting against wood that had warped from too many winters of moisture seeping up from the frozen ground. The bedroom was barely large enough for the bed, a washstand, and the straight-back chair where her mother spent most nights now, watching, waiting. Thomas Moore lay propped against pillows that had long since flattened, his once broad chest sunken, his skin holding that terrible yellow pallor that spoke of organs failing one by one. But his eyes were still sharp, still the eyes of the man who had taught her to read, to calculate figures, to see the world not as it appeared, but as it truly was. "Sit," he said, the single word costing him breath. Evelyn sat on the edge of the mattress, taking his hand in hers. His fingers were cold despite the quilts piled over him, the skin paper-thin over bones that seemed to grow more prominent with each passing day. "You know what needs saying," Thomas whispered. "Papa, let me finish." He squeezed her hand with what little strength remained. "The banknote comes due in 3 weeks. $412. We both know what's in the strongbox." Evelyn said nothing. She knew exactly what was in the strongbox beneath the loose floorboard in the corner. $37.16. Enough to bury him if she bargained hard with Hendricks. Not enough to save the land. "The timber rights alone are worth 5 times what we owe," Thomas continued, his voice strengthening slightly with the urgency of what he needed to say. "Harrison knows it. That's why he's calling the note early. That's why he's—" A coughing fit seized him, bending him forward, his whole body convulsing with the effort to expel what his lungs could no longer hold. Evelyn grabbed the cloth from the washstand, pressing it to his mouth, feeling the wetness soak through almost immediately. When the fit passed and she pulled the cloth away, she didn't look at it. She didn't need to see the red staining the white fabric to know what it meant. "Rest now," she said firmly. "We'll talk later." "There is no later." Thomas fell back against the pillows, his chest heaving. "Evelyn, listen to me. Harrison wants this land. He's wanted it since your grandfather first filed the claim. He'll get it too, one way or another, unless—" "Unless what?" Her father's eyes drifted toward the window, toward the gray morning light filtering through the frost-covered glass. "Unless you find another way The town of Ridgecrest had been dying for 3 years now. Evelyn walked its single muddy street that afternoon, her boots sinking into the half-frozen muck with each step. The silver mine that had given birth to the settlement had played out 2 winters ago, and most of the miners had moved on, to Leadville, to Cripple Creek, to anywhere that still held the promise of ore in the ground. What remained was a skeleton crew of merchants too stubborn to leave and families too poor to go anywhere else. The general store still operated, though its shelves held more dust than merchandise now. The saloon still poured whiskey, though its customers drank on credit that would never be repaid. The bank, Harrison's Bank, still stood at the end of the street, its false front freshly painted, a monument to the one man in Ridgecrest who had found a way to profit from everyone else's misfortune. Evelyn stopped outside the bank, staring at the neat gold lettering on the window, Harrison Savings and Loan, established 1879. She knew what waited inside. Silas Harrison would be sitting behind his mahogany desk, the one piece of furniture in town that looked like it belonged somewhere else, somewhere civilized, somewhere that hadn't been carved out of the wilderness by desperate men chasing dreams of silver. He would offer her his sympathies about her father's condition. He would express his deep regret that the note had come due at such an unfortunate time. And then he would explain, with that oily smile that never reached his eyes, that business was business. The land would be seized, the cabin would be emptied, and Evelyn and her mother would be turned out into the February cold with nothing but whatever they could carry. She turned away from the bank window before Harrison could look up and see her standing there like a beggar. She wouldn't give him that satisfaction. Not today, not ever. The walk back to the cabin took her past the church, closed now, the preacher having moved on 6 months ago, and past the schoolhouse where she had once taught the settlement's children their letters and numbers. That had ended when the families left, when there were no more children to teach, when the small salary the town council paid her dried up along with everything else. She was 23 years old. She could read Latin and do mathematics that would challenge most men. She could quote Shakespeare and explain the principles of natural philosophy, and none of it mattered. None of it could save her father or keep the roof over her mother's head. What good was education when you were starving? The question had plagued her for months now, ever since the illness had first taken hold of her father and their savings had begun to bleed away. Doctor's visits, medicines that didn't work, food that was increasingly hard to afford. She had applied for teaching positions in Denver, in Colorado Springs, even in small towns she'd never heard of. The responses, when they came at all, were polite rejections. The schools that were hiring wanted men. The families that needed governesses wanted women of better social standing than the daughter of a failed prospector turned homesteader. The world, Evelyn had learned, had very little use for poor women with too much education. She was so lost in thought that she almost walked past the man sitting on the bench outside the general store. Almost. He was impossible to miss once you actually looked at him. Not because he was remarkable in any obvious way, quite the opposite. He was the kind of man your eyes wanted to slide past, the kind of man who seemed designed to fade into the background of whatever scene he occupied. He wore clothes that had seen better days, a heavy canvas coat patched at the elbows, boots scuffed to the color of old mud, a hat with a brim that drooped slightly on one side. He sat perfectly still, his hands resting on his knees, watching the street with the patient stillness of a man who had learned to wait. Evelyn had never seen him before. In a settlement as small as Ridgecrest, that meant something. She felt his eyes on her as she passed, felt them register her, assess her, file her away in whatever mental catalog he was keeping. The sensation made her spine stiffen, made her lift her chin and quicken her pace. She didn't look back. That night, the fever came. Evelyn sat beside her father's bed as his temperature climbed, pressing cool cloths to his forehead, spooning water between his cracked lips, watching his chest rise and fall with each labored breath. Her mother had finally collapsed from exhaustion, sleeping in the main room wrapped in quilts beside the dying fire. Thomas drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes lucid, sometimes lost in memories that Evelyn could only glimpse through his rambling words. He spoke of her grandfather, of the day they had first come to this valley and seen the mountains rising against the sky like promises. He spoke of her mother as a young woman, beautiful and fierce, willing to follow him into the wilderness because she believed in what they could build together. "We were going to build something," he whispered, his eyes focused on something Evelyn couldn't see. Something that would last. Something we could leave behind. You did, Papa. Evelyn squeezed his hand. You built this. You built a life. Not enough. His head turned on the pillow, his fevered gaze finding her face. Not enough for you. Should have done more. Should have found a way to... Shh. She pressed the cool cloth to his brow again. Don't talk. Just rest. The stranger. Evelyn's hand stilled. What? The stranger. Thomas's eyes sharpened for a moment, cutting through the fever with sudden clarity. In town. The one watching. He came here. Before you got back. Asked about the land. Someone came here? While I was gone? Quiet man. Shabby clothes. But his eyes... Thomas shook his head slightly. His eyes didn't match his coat. Said he might have a proposition. Said he'd find you in town. Papa, who was he? But Thomas had already slipped back into the fever's grip, his words dissolving into mumbles that Evelyn couldn't parse. She sat back, her heart beating too fast, her mind racing with questions that had no answers. A stranger. Asking about the land. A proposition. In Evelyn's experience, men with propositions rarely had anything good to offer women in desperate circumstances. The world was full of predators who knew how to smell vulnerability, how to circle the wounded and wait for the moment to strike. But what choice did she have? She found him the next morning, in the same place she'd seen him the day before, sitting on the bench outside the general store, patient as stone. The February sun had broken through the clouds for the first time in days, casting long shadows across the frozen mud of the street. Evelyn stopped in front of him, her hands shoved deep into the pockets of her coat, her chin lifted in what she hoped was a posture of strength rather than desperation. You spoke to my father yesterday. The stranger looked up at her. His eyes were gray, pale gray, like winter sky before snow, like the color of weathered wood left too long in the elements. They held no warmth, but they held no cruelty either. Just that same patient watchfulness she'd felt the day before. I did. His voice surprised her. She had expected something rough, something that matched the worn state of his clothes. Instead, it was low and quiet, carefully modulated. The voice of a man who chose his words deliberately, who understood the weight of what he said and didn't say. He said you had a proposition. I might. Then say it plainly. I don't have time for games, Mr. Rowan? He rose from the bench slowly, unfolding a height that surprised her. Sitting down, he had seemed average, forgettable. Standing, he was nearly a head taller than her, broad through the shoulders in a way that his shabby coat couldn't quite disguise. Caleb Rowan? Evelyn Moore. She didn't offer her hand. What do you want with my family's land, Mr. Rowan? He studied her for a long moment, those gray eyes taking her measure with an intensity that made her want to look away. She held his gaze through sheer force of will. Not the land, he said finally. You. Something cold settled in Evelyn's stomach. She had heard this kind of proposition before, not directed at her but at other women in desperate circumstances. The girls who ended up in places like Denver's Market Street, selling themselves piece by piece until there was nothing left to sell. I think we're done here. She turned to leave. His voice stopped her. I'm offering marriage, Miss Moore. Not whatever you're thinking. Evelyn turned back slowly. Marriage? Yes. To a stranger? Yes. A stranger who dresses like he can barely afford his own boots. She let her gaze travel pointedly over his worn clothes. A stranger who sits on benches watching people like he has nothing better to do. A stranger who apparently has enough money to pay off $412 in bank debt, despite every appearance to the contrary. Something flickered in Caleb Rowan's eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or respect. You've done your arithmetic. I've done my thinking, which amounts to the same thing. Evelyn crossed her arms. So explain it to me, Mr. Rowan. Explain why a man who looks like you would offer to buy a woman he's never met. Explain what you're really after. Sit down. I'll stand. Then I'll sit. He settled back onto the bench, stretching his long legs out in front of him as if they had all the time in the world. I have land, Miss Moore. A great deal of it, up in the high country. What I don't have is a wife. There are agencies for that sort of thing, mail order arrangements. There are, he nodded slowly. I've considered them, but I find I prefer to choose for myself. And I prefer a woman who comes from this country, who understands what it takes to survive here. A woman who won't wilt the first time she sees a winter storm rolling in from the mountains. That's a reason to marry me specifically. Your father spoke of you. When I asked about the land, he told me the story of this valley, how his family came here, what they built, what they're about to lose. But mostly, he spoke of you. Caleb's gray eyes held hers. He said you were the smartest person he'd ever known. Said you had more courage than most men twice your age. Said you were wasted in a place like this. Evelyn felt something tighten in her throat. My father is dying. I know. And you want to use that. Use his death to leverage me into... I want to offer you a choice. Caleb's voice remained calm, unhurried. Not the only choice. Never that. A choice. Your bank debt paid in full. Your mother provided for, here on the land your family built, for as long as she lives. In exchange, you come with me, as my wife, as my partner, in what I'm building in the high country. And what exactly are you building, Mr. Rowan? What waits in this high country of yours? A cabin in the wilderness where I'll spend my days cooking and cleaning while you do whatever it is you actually do? For the first time, something like amusement crossed his weathered face. It didn't quite reach a smile, but it softened the hard lines around his mouth. Something like that, he said. At first. At first. At first. He rose again, standing before her with that quiet self-possession that seemed so at odds with his appearance. I'm not asking you to trust me, Miss Moore. I'm asking you to make a practical decision. You have one alternative. Watch your father die knowing that his life's work dies with him. Watch your mother turned out of her home. Watch Harrison take everything your family built. That's the path you're on. I'm offering you a different path, that's all. Evelyn stared at him, this strange, shabby man with eyes like winter and a voice like quiet certainty. Every instinct she had screamed that this was wrong, that there was something he wasn't telling her, something hidden beneath that carefully constructed exterior of poverty. But he was right about one thing. She didn't have alternatives. She had only impossible choices, and the luxury of pretending otherwise had run out weeks ago. I need to think. Caleb nodded once. I'll be here, but not for long, Miss Moore. I have business in Denver by week's end. If your answer is yes, we'll marry before I leave. If it's no, he shrugged slightly. Then I wish you well with whatever comes next. He sat back down on the bench, folding his hands in his lap, returning to that patient stillness that seemed to be his natural state. Evelyn turned and walked away without another word. Her father died 3 days later. It happened quietly in the small hours before dawn, while Evelyn sat beside his bed reading aloud from the volume of Tennyson that had been his favorite. She was halfway through Ulysses when she realized his breathing had stopped, when she looked up from the page and saw that his eyes had closed for the last time. She sat with him for a long while after that, still holding his cold hand, watching the first gray light of morning creep across the cabin floor. She didn't cry. The tears would come later, she knew, ambushing her at unexpected moments for months and years to come. But in that moment, she felt only a strange, hollow stillness, as if something essential had been carved out of her and nothing yet had grown to fill the space. Her mother woke to find her still sitting there, still holding Thomas's hand. The sound that came from Martha Moore's throat was something Evelyn would remember for the rest of her life. Grief-given voice, raw and terrible and utterly human. They buried him the next day, in the small cemetery behind the closed church, in a coffin that Mr. Hendricks had finished just in time. The ground was frozen hard, and it took 4 men most of the morning to dig a grave deep enough to satisfy propriety. The February wind howled down from the mountains, carrying ice crystals that stung exposed skin like tiny needles. Evelyn stood at the graveside in her mother's black dress, the one Martha had worn to her own mother's funeral 15 years ago. The fabric was worn thin at the elbows and too loose across Evelyn's shoulders, but it was the only black garment either of them owned. A handful of townspeople had come, Mr. Hendricks, the store owner, a few families who had known Thomas from the early days. Silas Harrison stood at the back of the small crowd, his face arranged in an expression of practiced sympathy that made Evelyn's hands curl into fists inside her coat pockets. And Caleb Rowan stood apart from everyone, at the edge of the cemetery, watching with those gray eyes that gave nothing away. Evelyn didn't acknowledge him. She kept her gaze fixed on the simple wooden cross that marked her father's grave, on the mound of frozen earth that would settle and sink come spring, on the words she had carved into the crosspiece herself: Thomas More, beloved husband and father. When the brief service ended and the crowd began to disperse, Harrison approached her. Up close, his sympathy looked even more fraudulent, a thin mask over the calculation in his small, dark eyes. Miss Moore. He removed his hat, holding it against his chest. Please accept my deepest condolences. Your father was a respected member of this community. Thank you, Mr. Harrison. I hate to mention such things at a time like this, but I'm afraid business cannot wait for grief. He reached into his coat pocket, producing a folded paper. The note on your property comes due in 18 days. Given the circumstances, I'm prepared to offer an extension of, shall we say, 1 week? That should give you time to make arrangements. Arrangements? For vacating the property. I understand there are boarding houses in Denver that cater to women in your situation. His smile was meant to be kind. It made Evelyn's skin crawl. Of course, if you wish to discuss alternative arrangements, I'm sure we could come to some understanding. You're an educated woman, after all. There might be positions available at the bank, clerical work, the sort of thing a woman of your abilities could manage quite capably. Evelyn felt her mother's hand grip her arm. Whether in warning or support, she couldn't tell. I'll consider your offer, Mr. Harrison. Please do. He replaced his hat, tipping it slightly. You know where to find me, Miss Moore, day or night. He turned and walked away, his polished boots somehow staying clean despite the mud, his expensive coat untouched by the wind that had been cutting through everyone else. Evelyn watched him go, something cold and hard crystallizing in her chest. She understood now what Harrison was offering. She had understood from the moment he mentioned alternative arrangements. The clerical position was a fiction, a thin veneer of respectability over what he actually wanted. She would be his mistress, hidden, shameful, powerless, or she would be homeless. Those were her choices. Except they weren't. Not anymore. She turned to find Caleb Rowan standing exactly where he had been throughout the service, patient as stone, waiting. Mr. Rowan. He walked toward her, his boots crunching on the frozen ground. Up close, she noticed details she had missed before. The way his shabby coat was actually well made despite its wear, the quality of the leather in his patched boots, the calluses on his hands that spoke of years of hard physical work. Miss Moore. His voice was low, meant for her ears alone. I'm sorry for your loss. Are you? I am. Something in his gray eyes shifted, softened almost imperceptibly. I lost my own father years ago. I know what it costs. Evelyn studied his face, looking for the lie, the manipulation, the angle. She found only that same quiet patience, that same careful watchfulness. Your offer, she said. It still stands? It does. And if I say yes, what happens then? We marry. Today, if you're willing, I know a circuit judge in the next town over who owes me a favor. Tomorrow we leave for the high country. Your mother stays here, on the land, with enough money to live comfortably for the rest of her days. The bank debt is paid. Harrison gets nothing. And me? What do I get? Caleb was silent for a moment, his gaze holding hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. That depends on you, he said finally. I'm offering you a life, Miss Moore. Not an easy life. Nothing in the high country is easy, but a real one. A chance to build something that matters. Whether you take that chance or not, that's your choice to make. Evelyn looked back at the cemetery, at the fresh mound of earth that marked her father's grave, at the frozen wilderness that stretched away in every direction. She thought of Harrison's oily smile, of the boarding houses in Denver, of the life that waited for her if she said no. She thought of her father's voice, fevered and fading. The stranger. His eyes didn't match his coat. When do we leave? The wedding was nothing like Evelyn had ever imagined. She had imagined once, when she was young and foolish and still believed the world would bend to meet her hopes. She had imagined flowers and music and a white dress her mother would make with her own hands. She had imagined a man she loved looking at her with eyes full of wonder, speaking vows that would echo through the rest of their lives together. Instead, she stood in the cramped parlor of Judge Whitmore's house, wearing her mother's black funeral dress because she had nothing else suitable, reciting words from a book the judge held open with trembling, liver-spotted hands. Caleb stood beside her, still in his worn clothes, his face revealing nothing as he repeated the phrases that would bind them together. "Do you, Evelyn Ann Moore, take this man to be your lawful, wedded husband?" "I do." 3 syllables, 2 words, the weight of her entire future compressed into a single breath. The judge pronounced them married. Caleb produced a ring from somewhere, plain gold, sized as if he had somehow known the circumference of her finger and slid it onto her hand. It fit perfectly. "You may kiss your bride," the judge said, something like curiosity flickering in his rheumy eyes. Caleb turned to her. For a moment, Evelyn thought she saw something beneath his careful composure. Uncertainty, perhaps, or the ghost of some emotion she couldn't name. Then he leaned down and pressed his lips to her forehead, the gesture oddly gentle, almost reverent. "Mrs. Rowan," he said quietly. "Mr. Rowan." They signed the papers. Caleb paid the judge, cash, Evelyn noticed, pulled from somewhere inside his coat with the ease of a man for whom money was not an object. The judge pocketed the bills without counting them and showed them to the door with the hurried efficiency of someone eager to return to his supper. Outside, the winter sun was already sinking toward the mountains. They had perhaps 2 hours of daylight left. "The high country is 3 days' ride from here," Caleb said, walking toward where 2 horses waited at the hitching post, his own and one he must have acquired for her, a sturdy mare with intelligent eyes. "We'll make camp tonight. Push on at first light." 3 days. Evelyn looked at the horses, at the provisions packed into saddlebags that looked far better quality than anything else Caleb owned. "Through the mountains, in February. I know the paths. Does anyone?" Something that might have been a smile ghosted across his weathered face. "I do." Evelyn gathered her skirts and mounted the mare, settling into the saddle with the practiced ease of a woman who had grown up in the high country. She might not know what waited at the end of this journey, but she knew how to ride. She knew how to survive. As they rode out of town, she looked back once, at the settlement that had been her home for 23 years, at the cabin where her mother now sat alone with her grief, at the cemetery where her father lay beneath frozen earth. She didn't cry. She had no tears left for the life she was leaving behind, only questions for the one that lay ahead. They camped that first night in a hollow between 2 ridges, sheltered from the wind by ancient pines whose branches bent under the weight of snow. Caleb built a fire with an efficiency that spoke of long practice, producing warmth from wood that Evelyn would have sworn was too wet to burn. She sat across from him, wrapped in a blanket that had appeared from his saddlebags along with dried meat, hard cheese, and bread that was only slightly stale. The food was better than anything she had eaten in months. She tried not to think about what that said about her circumstances. "Your mother will be all right," Caleb said, as if reading her thoughts. "I left instructions with the store owner. He'll check on her regularly. And the bank debt is paid. I saw to that before we left. Harrison has no claim on the land." "You paid it already? Before I said yes?" "I paid it when I first arrived in Ridgecrest." He poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling up into the darkness. "I try to handle obstacles before they become problems." "And if I had said no? If I had refused your proposal?" "Then your mother would have kept the land anyway." He shrugged slightly. "The money was already spent. No point in taking it back." Evelyn stared at him across the flames, trying to reconcile this information with everything else she knew, or thought she knew, about the man she had just married. "That's a great deal of money to risk on a stranger's decision." "Is it? $412? "Yes. For most people, that would be a fortune." Caleb said nothing, his gray eyes reflecting the firelight. The silence stretched between them, filled with the crackling of burning wood and the distant howl of wind across the ridge above. "You're not what you appear to be," Evelyn said finally. The clothes, the manner, the way you sat on that bench like a man with nothing in the world. It's all deliberate, isn't it? A disguise. Appearances can be useful. Useful for what? He was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the fire as if the answer might be found in its dancing flames. Tell me something, Mrs. Rowan. He looked up at her, and something in his expression had shifted, opened, perhaps, revealing a glimpse of the man beneath the mask. What do you know about timber? Timber? The question caught her off guard. I know it grows on trees. I know men cut it down and sell it. I know there's money in it, if you have enough land and enough labor. There is, Caleb nodded slowly. A great deal of money, as it happens. The railroad companies are hungry for ties. The mining operations need support beams. The towns spreading across the territory need lumber for building. Timber, Mrs. Rowan, is the foundation of everything else. And you have timber. I have more timber than you can imagine. He leaned forward, his voice dropping. I have an entire valley, high in the mountains, that no one knows exists. I've spent 15 years building something there, carefully, quietly, without drawing the attention of the men who would take it from me if they knew. Men like Harrison. Men like Harrison are nothing. Something hard entered Caleb's voice, the first real emotion she had heard from him. There are others, men with real power, men who have been trying to find my valley for years. They know it exists, rumor of it anyway. They don't know where. And I intend to keep it that way. Evelyn felt the hairs rise on the back of her neck. And you brought me into this? Into whatever war you're fighting? I brought you in because I need someone I can trust. He held her gaze, unflinching. I've been alone too long, Mrs. Rowan, built too much to have no one to share it with. And when I saw you, when your father spoke of you, I knew. Knew what? That you were what I had been looking for. Someone strong enough to survive the high country, smart enough to understand what we're building, desperate enough to take the risk. A ghost of a smile. I don't apologize for that last part. Desperation is honest. It strips away the pretense and shows what a person really is. And what am I? A survivor. He said it simply, as if stating an obvious fact. Like me. The fire crackled between them. Outside their small shelter, the wind moaned through the pines like a living thing. Evelyn pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders, feeling the weight of everything she didn't know pressing down on her. She had married a stranger. She had left behind everything she knew. She was riding into the wilderness with a man who admitted to hiding an empire, to fighting enemies she couldn't see, to needing her for reasons she didn't fully understand. It was mad. It was dangerous. It was quite possibly the worst decision she had ever made, and yet, for the first time in months, she felt something other than despair. She felt the stirring of possibility, faint as the first green shoot pushing through spring snow, but real. She was no longer waiting for the end of everything she knew. She was riding toward the beginning of something else. The next 2 days blurred together in Evelyn's memory, an endless procession of narrow trails and frozen streams, of pine forests so thick the sky disappeared behind their canopy, of mountains that rose on every side like walls designed to keep the world out. Caleb led them with a certainty that bordered on uncanny. He seemed to know every rock, every twist in the trail, every place where the snow might give way and send them tumbling into ravines that had no bottom. More than once, Evelyn was convinced they had reached a dead end, only to watch him guide his horse through what appeared to be solid forest and emerge onto another hidden path. They spoke little during the day. The trails were too treacherous for conversation, demanding complete attention from both rider and mount. But at night, beside fires that Caleb coaxed from unwilling wood, they talked. He told her about the valley, not where it was or how to find it, but what it held. He spoke of stands of Douglas fir that stretched for miles, of pines so tall they blocked out the stars, of timber operations that shipped wood throughout the territory without anyone knowing where it came from. He spoke of the men who worked for him, mountain people who valued privacy and loyalty above all else. He spoke of the years he had spent building something from nothing, patient as the trees themselves. And Evelyn, in turn, told him about herself, about the books she had read and the dreams she had buried, about the students she had taught and the lessons she had learned. about her father's vision of what the West could be, not a place of exploitation and extraction, but of building and growing, of creating something that would endure beyond a single generation. "That's why I came looking for you," Caleb said, on the third night when the air had grown somehow colder and stiller, as if the mountains were holding their breath. "When I heard about your family, about your land, I thought, here's someone who understands, someone who sees what I see." "What do you see?" He was silent for a long moment, staring into the fire. "Most men who come to these mountains want to take," he said finally. "Cut the trees, dig the ore, strip the land down to nothing. They don't care what comes after. They don't think about what they're leaving behind." "And you're different?" "I try to be." He looked up at her, and something in his gray eyes burned with an intensity that made her breath catch. "I've watched what happens when men take without thought. I've seen valleys stripped bare, mountains torn apart, streams choked with waste until nothing can live in them. I swore I would build something else, something sustainable, something that would last. That's why you hide what you have. That's part of it." He nodded. "If the big companies knew what I'd built, they'd come for it. They'd strip my valley, just like they've stripped everything else. So I stay hidden. I deal through intermediaries. I let people think I'm just another poor cowboy scratching a living from the wilderness. And now you've brought a wife into your hidden kingdom. Now I've brought a partner." He held her gaze. "I meant what I said, Mrs. Rowan. I don't need a servant or a decoration. I need someone who can think, who can plan, who can help me build what I'm building, if you're willing." Evelyn looked at this strange man she had married, this man who hid empires behind worn boots and patched coats, who spoke of building rather than taking, who had seen something in her that she had almost forgotten existed. "I'm willing to try," she said. It was the most honest thing she had said since her father died. The morning of the fourth day, they crested a ridge, and Evelyn saw the valley for the first time. She understood, in that moment, why Caleb had hidden it so carefully. It was beautiful. Not the wild, harsh beauty of the mountains they had been traveling through, but something else. A beauty that spoke of shelter, of abundance, of life carefully tended rather than allowed to run wild. The valley floor stretched out below them, a patchwork of snow-covered meadows and stands of timber that seemed to have been placed with deliberate intention. She could see buildings scattered across the landscape, not crude cabins, but actual structures designed with purpose. A main house stood near the center, larger than anything she had expected. Near it, she could make out what looked like barns, storehouses, and smaller buildings she couldn't immediately identify. Trails wound through the valley like veins, connecting everything, leading to places she couldn't see from the ridge. And everywhere, on every slope, climbing every hillside, there were trees. More trees than Evelyn had ever imagined in one place. A forest that seemed to go on forever. "Welcome home," Caleb said quietly, and there was something in his voice she hadn't heard before. Not pride exactly, but something deeper. The love a man might feel for a child he had raised or a dream he had built into reality. "This is yours." "This is ours now." He turned to look at her, and for the first time she saw something like vulnerability in his gray eyes. "If you still want it to be." Evelyn looked out over the hidden valley, over the timber empire that her shabby, quiet husband had built in secret, over the future that waited for her if she was brave enough to claim it. She thought of the girl who had stood at her cabin window watching the coffin maker work. She thought of the woman who had walked through the mud of a dying settlement, counting the days until everything fell apart. That woman had married survival, but the one who sat on this ridge, looking down at a kingdom no one knew existed, might just have married something more. "I want it," she said, and meant every word. The descent into the valley took the better part of the morning, following switchback trails that seemed carved into the mountainside by someone who understood exactly how to move through this landscape without being seen. Caleb rode ahead, his horse picking its way down paths that Evelyn would have sworn were invisible until they were directly upon them. Every few hundred yards she noticed something, a fallen tree positioned just so, a boulder that blocked sight lines from above, a thick stand of brush that concealed the trail's continuation. None of it was accidental. "You built these paths," she said, not a question. Caleb glanced back over his shoulder. Took 7 years to get them right. A man could ride within 50 feet of most of these trails and never know they were there. And if someone did find them, if they followed you in, they wouldn't get far. He said it simply, without boast or threat. Just fact. The valley has protections. Evelyn didn't ask what that meant. She wasn't sure she wanted to know. Not yet. As they descended, the air grew somehow warmer, the brutal February wind that had cut through them on the ridges fading to something almost gentle. The trees here were different too, larger, healthier, their branches heavy with needles that still held the deep green of summer rather than the dull gray green of winter-stressed timber. It was as if the valley existed in its own climate, sheltered from the harsh realities of the world beyond its walls. They emerged from the forest onto a meadow that stretched toward the main house, and Evelyn got her first clear look at what Caleb had built. The house was larger than she had realized from the ridge, 2 stories of solid log construction, with a wide porch that wrapped around 3 sides and windows of actual glass that caught the morning light. Smoke rose from 2 chimneys, suggesting warmth waiting inside. The construction was not fancy, not the kind of ornate Victorian architecture that wealthy men built to display their status, but there was a solidity to it, a sense of permanence that spoke of careful planning and skilled hands. Beyond the house, she could see the outbuildings more clearly now. A barn large enough to hold a dozen horses, what looked like a bunkhouse, several smaller structures whose purpose she couldn't guess, and everywhere signs of activity, footprints in the snow, cleared paths between buildings, the lingering smell of wood smoke and something cooking. "How many people live here?" Evelyn asked. 37 at the moment, more during cutting season. Caleb reined his horse to a stop at the edge of the meadow, turning to face her. "Mrs. Rowan, before we go any further, there are things you need to understand." She met his gray eyes steadily. "Then tell me." "The people who live and work here, they're not ordinary laborers. Most of them came to me the same way you did, running from something, desperate for a fresh start. I gave them that, and in return they give me their loyalty, their discretion." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "They've been told I was bringing back a wife. They'll accept you because I vouch for you, but trust, real trust, that you'll have to earn." I would expect nothing less. Something flickered in his expression, approval, perhaps, or relief. "One more thing. Down in that valley, among these people, I'm not a poor cowboy. I'm not the shabby stranger who sat on a bench in Ridgecrest. Here, I'm something else. You'll see what I mean soon enough." Before Evelyn could respond, a figure emerged from the main house and began walking toward them across the snow-covered meadow. A woman, tall and broad-shouldered, with steel-gray hair pulled back in a severe bun, and a face that looked like it had been carved from the same granite as the mountains. She walked with the purposeful stride of someone who had never wasted a step in her life. "That would be Mrs. Harlan," Caleb said, something almost like warmth entering his voice. "She's run this house since before the walls were finished. She'll be the one to show you how things work here." The woman, Mrs. Harlan, stopped a few feet from where they sat their horses, her sharp blue eyes moving from Caleb to Evelyn and back again. Whatever she saw in that assessment, she kept to herself. "Mr. Rowan," her voice was as no-nonsense as the rest of her, "we expected you yesterday. Weather in the high passes, the new route is still settling." Mrs. Harlan nodded once, accepting this explanation without comment. Then her gaze fixed on Evelyn with an intensity that made Evelyn feel like she was being weighed on some invisible scale. "So this is the bride. This is Mrs. Evelyn Rowan." Caleb dismounted, moving to help Evelyn down from her own horse. "Evelyn, this is Margaret Harlan. Anything you need to know about how this household runs, she's the one to ask." Evelyn met the older woman's assessing stare without flinching. "Mrs. Harlan, I'm grateful for the welcome." Mrs. Harlan's expression gave nothing away. "We'll see about that, won't we? Come inside, both of you. There's food waiting, and Mr. Garrett has been asking for you since sunrise, Mr. Rowan. Something about the north cutting site." She turned and walked back toward the house without waiting to see if they would follow. Caleb caught Evelyn's eye, and something that might have been amusement crossed his weathered face. "She's not as cold as she seems," he said quietly. "Give her time." "I wasn't worried." "No." He studied her for a moment. I don't suppose you were. The interior of the house was a revelation. Evelyn had expected rough-hewn practicality, the kind of frontier functionality that sacrificed comfort for necessity. What she found instead was warmth, not just from the fires burning in two separate hearths, but from the careful attention that had been paid to making this place a home. The floors were polished wood, covered in places with thick rugs that looked like they had come from somewhere far more civilized than a hidden mountain valley. The furniture was solid and well made, not beautiful by city standards, but comfortable in a way that spoke of long evenings spent reading by firelight. Books lined one entire wall of the main room, more books than Evelyn had seen anywhere outside of the school library in Ridgecrest. "You have a library," she said, unable to keep the wonder from her voice. Caleb followed her gaze to the shelves. "My mother was a school teacher back east. She believed every home should have books. After she passed, I kept adding to what she'd started." He paused. "You can read anything you like. It's yours now, too." Evelyn moved toward the shelves as if drawn by a force she couldn't resist. Her fingers traced the spines. Shakespeare, Dickens, scientific treatises on forestry and geology, histories of the Roman Empire and the American Revolution. There was poetry here, philosophy, even a few novels that would have scandalized the ladies of any proper Eastern parlor. "You've read all of these?" "Most of them, some more than once." Caleb had moved to stand beside her, his voice quiet. "Winter nights are long up here. A man has to fill them with something." "Mr. Rowan," Mrs. Harlan's voice cut through from the doorway. "Your breakfast is getting cold, and Mr. Garrett is waiting in the study." Caleb nodded, but his eyes stayed on Evelyn. "Mrs. Harlan will show you to our rooms. Get settled. Rest if you need to. We'll talk more this evening once I've dealt with whatever crisis Garrett has manufactured in my absence." "Of course." He turned to leave, then stopped. "Evelyn." It was the first time he had used her given name since their wedding. She looked up to find him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Welcome home," he said. And then he was gone, his boot falls fading down some corridor she couldn't see. Mrs. Harlan appeared at her elbow with the silent efficiency that seemed to be her hallmark. "This way, Mrs. Rowan. I'll show you where you'll be staying." The rooms Evelyn had been given occupied the entire east corner of the house's second floor. A sitting room with its own small hearth, a bedroom larger than the entire cabin she had grown up in, and a small alcove that Mrs. Harlan identified as the morning room, with the implication that ladies of quality required such spaces for their correspondence and contemplation. "Mr. Rowan had these rooms prepared specially," Mrs. Harlan said, her tone giving nothing away. "He's been planning for your arrival for some time." "Has he?" Evelyn moved to the window, looking out over the valley. From here she could see more of the operation, men moving between buildings, wagons being loaded with what looked like supplies, horses being led toward distant tree lines. "Mrs. Harlan, how long have you worked for my husband?" 11 years. The older woman's voice softened almost imperceptibly. "I came here with my husband, Jonas, back when there was nothing but a half-built cabin and Mr. Rowan's determination to see it through. Jonas passed 3 winters ago. A tree fell wrong during a storm, but I stayed. I'm sorry for your loss." So was Mr. Rowan. He sat with Jonas all night at the end. Dug the grave himself come morning, even though there were 20 men who would have done it for him. Mrs. Harlan moved to the bed, smoothing an already smooth quilt with practiced hands. "He's not an easy man to know, Mrs. Rowan. He keeps himself closed off, even from those of us who've been here since the beginning. But he's fair. He's honest, and he builds things that last." "Why are you telling me this?" Mrs. Harlan's sharp blue eyes met Evelyn's. "Because you look like a woman who's wondering what she's gotten herself into. And because Mr. Rowan deserves someone who will take the time to see him clearly, not just the mask he wears for the outside world." Before Evelyn could respond, Mrs. Harlan was already moving toward the door. "Dinner is at 6. Mr. Rowan takes his meals in the main dining room when he's in residence. I'll send someone to fetch you when it's time." Then she was gone, leaving Evelyn alone with her thoughts and the vast silence of the mountain valley. The next several days passed in a blur of discovery and adjustment. Evelyn learned the rhythms of the household, Breakfast at dawn, the midday meal at noon for those who weren't working in the far reaches of the valley, dinner as the sun touched the western ridges. She learned the names of the people who moved through the house with quiet efficiency. Mrs. Harlan, of course, but also the cook, a round-faced woman named Sarah, who seemed to produce meals for 40 from a kitchen that should have been too small for the task. The two young women who helped with cleaning and laundry, sisters from somewhere in Kansas who never spoke of why they had left. The old man called simply Cooper, who seemed to have no specific duty but was treated with the deference usually reserved for elders of great wisdom. She learned that Caleb was rarely in the house during daylight hours. He left before breakfast most mornings, riding out to supervise the cutting operations, or inspect some distant corner of his holdings, returning after dark with mud on his boots and exhaustion etched into the lines of his face. When they did share meals, their conversations were careful, polite, circling each other like two people trying to learn a dance whose steps they had never been taught. "The north site is producing ahead of schedule," he would tell her. "We'll make the spring shipment with room to spare." "Mrs. Harlan showed me the account books today," she would reply. "You have a sophisticated system for tracking inventory and labor costs." And they would nod at each other across the table, two strangers playing at being married, while the fire crackled and the wind howled outside, and neither of them said what they were actually thinking. On the fifth day, Evelyn decided she had seen enough of the inside of the house. She found Caleb in the study shortly after dawn, reviewing what looked like survey maps spread across a large oak desk. He looked up when she entered, surprise flickering briefly across his features before settling back into his usual composed expression. "You're up early. I want to see the operation." His eyebrows rose slightly. "The cutting sites are a hard ride from here. The weather—" "I can ride. You know I can ride. And I've spent 5 days learning how your household runs. Now I want to understand how you make your money." For a long moment, Caleb simply looked at her, those gray eyes studying her as if seeing something new, something he hadn't noticed before. Then slowly, the corner of his mouth curved upward in what might have been the beginning of a smile. "All right then, Mrs. Rowan. Get your coat." The cutting site was 3 hours' ride from the main house, following trails that wound through timber so thick it blocked out the sky. Caleb rode beside her this time, not ahead, and as they traveled, he began to explain what she was seeing. Douglas fir, mostly. Some ponderosa pine on the lower slopes. We harvest selectively, take the mature trees, leave the young ones to grow. Most operations clear-cut strip everything down to bare earth. I take what I need and leave the rest standing. "That's why your forests still look like forests," Evelyn said, understanding dawning. "You're not destroying them. You're cultivating them." Something like that. He guided his horse around a fallen log. "My father worked in the Pennsylvania timber camps when he was young. Watched them cut down entire mountainsides in a single season. He used to say they were eating their seed corn, taking everything today and leaving nothing for tomorrow. I swore I would do things differently." "And this works? Financially?" "It takes longer. We harvest less per year than a clear-cut operation would. But we harvest year after year, decade after decade. The companies that strip the land bare move on when the trees are gone. I stay." The cutting site itself was a clearing in the forest where perhaps a dozen men worked with axes and saws, felling trees that had been marked with splashes of white paint. Evelyn watched as a massive fir came down with a crash that seemed to shake the earth itself, the men scattering out of its path with the practiced ease of long experience. "Mr. Rowan," a man approached them as they dismounted, tall, lean, with the weathered face of someone who had spent his entire life outdoors. "Didn't expect to see you today. The new wife keeping you busy?" There was a hint of teasing in his voice, the familiarity of long acquaintance. "Mrs. Rowan wanted to see what we do here, Garrett." Caleb gestured toward Evelyn. "Evelyn, this is Sam Garrett. He runs the cutting operations, has since the beginning." Garrett turned toward her, and Evelyn saw him take in her clothes, her posture, the way she stood with easy balance despite the rough terrain. Whatever assessment he was making, he seemed satisfied by what he found. "Ma'am," he touched the brim of his hat. "Word around the house is you've been reading the account books. Someone should. They're very well kept." "That'd be Cooper's doing. Man was a bookkeeper in San Francisco before—" "Well, before." Garrett glanced at Caleb. You going to show her the mill? I thought I might. Good. Garrett grinned, revealing teeth that had seen better days. She should see what all this wood actually turns into. The mill was another hour's ride from the cutting site, built beside a river that Evelyn hadn't even known existed until they crested a ridge, and there it was. A building of surprising size, its wooden walls weathered to gray, a massive wheel turning slowly in the rushing water. Water-powered, Caleb explained as they approached. Cuts the logs into boards without needing steam engines or coal. Quieter, too. Less visible from above. You really have thought of everything. I've tried to. He dismounted, holding her horse's bridle while she did the same. This is where raw timber becomes something people will pay for. We can mill 600 board feet a day when we're running at capacity. Inside, the noise was tremendous. The shriek of saw blades biting into wood, the crash of boards falling into collection bins, the shouts of men coordinating the complex dance of processing raw logs into finished lumber. Evelyn watched it all with the attention she would have given a mathematical proof, noting how each piece of the system connected to the next, how efficiency had been built into every step. "Where does it go?" she asked, raising her voice above the din. "The finished lumber. How do you get it out of the valley without revealing where it comes from?" Caleb led her back outside, where the relative quiet felt almost deafening after the mill's roar. "That's the clever part. We wagon it to a cache about 20 miles from here, outside the valley, in territory that could belong to any number of operations. From there, my buyers pick it up. They think they're purchasing from a small outfit working the public lands. They have no idea how much actually flows through that cache point. Your buyers don't ask questions? They get quality lumber at fair prices, delivered reliably. In my experience, Mrs. Rowan, people don't ask questions when they're getting what they want." Evelyn turned to face him, the wind whipping strands of hair across her face. "But someone must be curious. An operation this size, this sophisticated, someone must have tried to find its source." Something hardened in Caleb's gray eyes. They do, regularly. And they don't find anything because I've spent 15 years making sure they can't." He was quiet for a moment, looking out over the river. "There are men in Denver who would pay a fortune to know where this valley is. Mining companies who want the water rights. Timber barons who want to clear-cut every tree on these slopes. Railroad men who want the land for their lines. I've made enemies of all of them, Mrs. Rowan, simply by existing, by proving that another way is possible." "Is that why you married me?" The question came out before she could stop it. "Because you need someone to help you fight them." Caleb turned to look at her, and something in his expression shifted, opened in a way she hadn't seen before. "I married you because I was tired of building alone, because I wanted someone who could understand what this place means, what it could become. Someone who would see it as more than just timber and money." He paused. "I married you because when I heard your father speak of you, I thought, there's someone who might actually care about the same things I care about. Was I wrong?" Evelyn held his gaze, feeling the weight of the question, the vulnerability beneath it. This man who hid empires behind worn coats and disguises, who trusted no one, who had built walls around himself as carefully as he had built walls around this valley. He was asking her, truly asking her, whether she was what he hoped she might be. "You weren't wrong," she said quietly. "But caring isn't the same as being useful." "What would you actually have me do here, Caleb, beyond reading account books and learning the household routines?" He smiled then, a real smile, the first she had seen from him, and it transformed his weathered face into something almost handsome. "I was hoping you might figure that out for yourself. You seem like a woman who doesn't wait to be told what's needed." "That I am." She looked back at the mill, at the river, at the valley stretching away in every direction. "But I'll need to understand everything first. All of it. The operations, the finances, the buyers, the enemies. If I'm going to be your partner, and that is what you said you wanted, isn't it? A partner? Then I need to know what I'm partnering in." "That seems fair." "Then start teaching me." She met his eyes. "Everything. The truth of it, not the version you show to strangers. I want to know what you've built, and I want to know what threatens it. And then," she took a breath, "then we can talk about what happens next." Caleb studied her for a long moment, the smile fading into something more serious, more searching. Then he nodded once. All right, Mrs. Rowan. Let's start at the beginning. Over the following weeks, Evelyn threw herself into learning everything about the valley and its operations. She rode with Caleb to the cutting sites, watching how the men worked, asking questions that surprised them with their precision. She spent hours with Cooper, the old bookkeeper, understanding the intricate system of accounts that tracked every log cut, every board milled, every dollar earned and spent. She learned which buyers could be trusted and which ones asked too many questions. She learned the names and stories of the 37 people who called this valley home, understanding for the first time what Caleb had meant when he said they had all come here running from something. There was Marcus, the foreman at the mill, who had fled Virginia after the war with scars on his back and a price on his head for refusing to stay in the bondage that laws still permitted in practice, if not in name. There was Elena, who had walked away from a brutal husband in Santa Fe, arriving at the valley half dead from exposure and emerging as one of the best trail guides Caleb had ever employed. There were men who had been miners and men who had been farmers, women who had been servants, and women who had been something else entirely in the desperate economies of frontier towns. Every one of them had been given a second chance. Every one of them would die before they betrayed the valley's location. That's your real power, isn't it? Evelyn said one evening, sitting across from Caleb in the main room while the fire cast dancing shadows on the walls. Not the timber, not the money, the loyalty of people who have nowhere else to go. Caleb looked up from the correspondence he was reviewing, something flickering in his gray eyes. Loyalty earned is worth more than loyalty bought. These people know that if this place falls, they fall with it. That's not coercion, that's partnership. And if someone offered them more money, if one of your enemies promised them a fortune to reveal the valley's location, it's been tried. His voice was flat. 3 years ago, a man named Davies approached one of my buyers, started asking questions, offered $5,000 for anyone who could tell him where the lumber actually came from. What happened? Garrett's brother was working as a scout at the time, running shipments to the cash point. Davies tracked him down, made the offer in person. Caleb set down the letter he had been reading. Tom Garrett turned him down. Davies didn't take kindly to being refused. There was a confrontation. Tom didn't survive it. Evelyn felt something cold settle in her stomach. And Davies? He didn't survive either. Caleb's voice held no apology, no regret. I don't start fights, Mrs. Rowan, but I finish them. She should have been frightened, perhaps, by the casual way he spoke of death, of violence, of finishing things. Instead, she found herself understanding, for the first time, the full scope of what she had married into. This was not a business. This was a fortress. And the man who commanded it had built walls not just of stone and secrecy, but of fierce, uncompromising loyalty. There's something else you should know, Caleb said, watching her carefully. Davies worked for a man named Victor Ashworth. Have you heard the name? Evelyn searched her memory. The railroad magnate? He was in the Denver newspapers sometimes. Very wealthy, very powerful. Very dangerous. Caleb leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. Ashworth has been trying to find this valley for 12 years. He knows it exists. Too many rumors, too much lumber flowing from somewhere that shouldn't exist. He sent men before Davies. He'll send more. And one day, one of them might actually find what he's looking for. What would he do? If he found us? He would destroy everything. Caleb said it simply, without drama. Not because he needs the timber, he has more money than he could spend in 10 lifetimes, but because I represent something he can't tolerate, an alternative, a way of doing things that doesn't require him or men like him. So we live in hiding, forever, always watching for the enemy at the gates. We live in strength, Caleb's gray eyes held hers. We build what we build, we protect what we have, and we trust that the walls I've constructed will hold. But yes, the threat is always there, will always be there. Evelyn was quiet for a long moment, absorbing this. The fire crackled, the wind moaned outside. Somewhere in the house, she could hear Mrs. Harlan giving instructions to the kitchen staff about tomorrow's meal. Then we need better walls, she said finally. Caleb's eyebrows rose slightly. What do you mean? I mean that secrecy alone isn't enough. Secrecy is a wall that only has to fail once. If Ashworth ever does find this valley, when he finds it, because men like that don't stop looking, we need something else. Other defenses, legal protections, political connections, ways to fight that don't depend on no one knowing where we are. I've thought about that. The problem is that every connection we make is a potential leak. Every legal document is a paper trail. Every political ally is someone who could be bought. So we make connections that can't be bought. We find allies who have reasons beyond money to stand with us. Evelyn felt something stirring in her chest, the sensation she used to feel when working through a difficult mathematical proof, when the pieces started falling into place. Your people here, they're loyal because they have nowhere else to go. What if we could create that same loyalty in the outside world? What if there were people in Denver, in Washington, who had reasons to protect what you've built? Caleb studied her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. You're talking about something much larger than a timber operation. I'm talking about survival. She rose from her chair, pacing toward the window. You've built a fortress, but fortresses can be starved out, worn down, eventually breached. What you need, what we need, is an empire, not of land and trees, but of influence, of relationships, of leverage. And you think you know how to build that? Evelyn turned to face him, silhouetted against the dark glass. I think I know how to start. I was a teacher, Caleb. I know how to identify potential, how to build relationships, how to see what people need before they know they need it, and I know how to learn. Give me access to everything, your correspondence, your contacts, your history with men like Ashworth. Let me understand the full landscape, and then let me help you reshape it. The room fell silent. The fire's crackling seemed louder in the absence of words. Evelyn could feel her heart beating against her ribs, could feel the enormity of what she was proposing hanging in the air between them. Then Caleb smiled, that same transformative smile she had seen once before, the one that made him look almost like a different man. I knew there was a reason I married you. Does that mean yes? He rose, crossing the room to stand before her. Up close, she could see the flecks of darker gray in his eyes, the fine lines around his mouth, the weathering that spoke of years spent in sun and wind and cold. He was not a handsome man in any conventional sense, but there was something compelling about him, a solidity, a presence that made it difficult to look away. It means yes, he said quietly. It means I'm trusting you with everything I've built, everything I am. He reached out, his calloused hand cupping her cheek with surprising gentleness. Don't make me regret it. Evelyn felt the warmth of his palm against her skin, felt something shift in the space between them, something that had nothing to do with business or strategy or survival. I won't, she said, and meant it. Spring came slowly to the high country, creeping up from the lower elevations, one tentative green shoot at a time. The snow began to recede from the valley floor, revealing meadows that would soon be thick with wildflowers. The river swelled with snowmelt, turning the mill wheel faster, increasing their output for the crucial spring shipments. Evelyn had established her office in a corner of Caleb's study, her own desk positioned where she could look out the window at the valley below while she worked. She had demanded and received access to every document, every letter, every record of Caleb's 15 years of building, and she had thrown herself into understanding it all with a focus that surprised even herself. The scope of what he had created was larger than she had imagined. Beyond the valley itself, Caleb maintained interests in 3 different bank accounts under 3 different names in 3 different cities. He had silent partnerships in a freight company, a small newspaper, and a general store in a town Evelyn had never heard of. He owned property, modest parcels, nothing that would attract attention, in Denver, San Francisco, and a tiny settlement in Nevada that might or might not still exist. You've been preparing, she said one afternoon, looking up from a stack of property deeds. For years, building escape routes, contingencies, alternatives. When you have something worth protecting, you plan for ways to protect it. Caleb was working at his own desk, reviewing the spring cutting schedules. If the valley falls, I want options. But you've never used them, never activated any of these contingencies. Never needed to. He set down his pen. So far. So far? Evelyn tapped her finger against the deeds. Tell me about the newspaper, the one in Colorado Springs. Why do you own part of a newspaper? The Rocky Mountain Herald, small operation, barely profitable. But it has a voice in local politics, and sometimes a voice is useful. Has it been useful? Have you ever actually used it? Once. 3 years ago, when the territorial legislature was considering a bill that would have given large landholders the right to claim water sources on public land, the Herald published a series of articles questioning who exactly would benefit from such a law. The bill died in committee. And no one connected you to those articles? No one knows I own part of the Herald. The investment was made through intermediaries. He paused, something like curiosity entering his expression. Why do you ask? Evelyn stood, bringing the stack of documents to his desk. Because this is exactly what I was talking about. You have influence. You have reach. You have the ability to shape conversations, to affect outcomes, to protect your interests without anyone knowing you're the one doing it. But you've only used it once, defensively, when you were already under threat. What would you have me do instead? Be proactive. She spread the papers across his desk, pointing to different items as she spoke. The newspaper. Use it to build relationships with journalists, with politicians, with people who shape public opinion. The freight company. Use it to understand who's shipping what, where, to whom. The bank accounts. Use them to invest in projects that align with your interests, that create allies without them even knowing they're your allies. That sounds like politics. It is politics, but it's also survival. You've been hiding for 15 years, Caleb, building walls, staying invisible, hoping that secrecy alone would keep you safe. What I'm suggesting is something different. Build networks, build influence, build a world where even if someone like Ashworth finds this valley, destroying it would cost him more than he's willing to pay. Caleb was quiet for a long moment, studying the papers she had spread before him. Then he looked up, meeting her eyes with an expression she couldn't quite read. You've been here 2 months, he said slowly, and you're proposing to reorganize everything I've spent 15 years building. Not reorganize, expand, strengthen, make it something that can survive the daylight, not just the shadows. You really believe this is possible? I believe it's necessary. Evelyn held his gaze. The question is whether you're willing to trust me enough to try. Another silence stretched between them. The spring wind rattled the windows. Somewhere outside, a horse whinnied. Then Caleb laughed, an actual laugh, rusty from disuse but genuine. My wife the strategist, who would have thought? Your wife the survivor, she corrected. I've spent my whole life watching people lose everything because they weren't prepared. I won't let that happen here. Not to you. Not to this place. Not to the people who depend on it. He reached out, taking her hand in his. His palm was warm, rough with calluses, strong and certain. Then let's begin, he said. Show me what you see. And so, as spring turned the valley green and the cutting crews worked from dawn to dusk, Evelyn and Caleb sat in his study night after night, planning a future that neither of them could see but both of them believed in. They were still strangers in many ways, two people bound by contract rather than love, learning each other's rhythms and silences, navigating the strange intimacy of a marriage built on practicality rather than passion. But something was growing between them nonetheless, something that felt like respect, something that felt like possibility, something that neither of them had names for yet, but both of them could feel taking root. The girl who had married survival was becoming something else, and the fortress in the mountains was preparing for war. The letter arrived on a morning in late June, carried by a rider who had pushed his horse nearly to collapse crossing the passes from Denver. Evelyn was in the study reviewing shipping manifests when Mrs. Harlan brought it in, her face tight with an expression that Evelyn had learned to recognize as controlled alarm. For Mr. Rowan, Mrs. Harlan said. The writer says it's urgent. He's waiting for a response. Caleb was at the North Cutting site and wouldn't return until nightfall. Evelyn took the letter, noting the quality of the paper, the precise hand that had written Caleb's name, the seal pressed into dark red wax. A railroad spike crossed with a timber axe. She knew that seal. She had seen it in Caleb's files, on documents he had shown her during their long nights of planning. It was Victor Ashworth's personal mark. Tell the writer to rest and eat, Evelyn said, keeping her voice steady. Mr. Rowan will send his response when he returns. Mrs. Rowan. Mrs. Harlan hesitated at the door. Should I send someone to fetch him? Evelyn considered this. Whatever was in this letter, Caleb would want to know immediately. But pulling him away from the cutting site would signal to everyone that something was wrong. And in a community built on secrets, that kind of signal could spread panic faster than wildfire. No, let him finish his work, but have his horse ready when he arrives. He'll want to read this before dinner. Mrs. Harlan nodded and withdrew, leaving Evelyn alone with the letter that seemed to pulse with malevolent intent in her hands. She didn't open it. That wasn't her place, not yet. But she held it up to the light from the window, trying to make out anything through the heavy paper. She could see only shadows, the ghost of handwriting that revealed nothing. The hours until Caleb's return stretched like years. He came in just as the sun was touching the western ridges, dusty and tired from a day of supervising the most difficult cutting operation of the season. Evelyn met him at the door of the study, the letter already extended in her hand. This came today, from Denver. Ashworth's seal. Caleb's face went still in that way she had learned meant he was processing something dangerous. He took the letter, turned it over once, then broke the seal with his thumbnail and unfolded the paper. Evelyn watched his eyes move across the words, watched the color drain from his weathered face, watched his jaw tighten until the muscles stood out like cords. What is it? He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he crossed to his desk, sat down heavily, and read the letter again, then a third time. When he finally looked up, his gray eyes held something she had never seen there before: fear. He knows, Caleb said quietly. Not where we are, not yet, but he knows we exist. He knows the lumber is real, and he's done pretending otherwise. What does he want? Caleb handed her the letter. Evelyn read it quickly, her heart beating faster with each line. The language was formal, almost cordial. Victor Ashworth expressed his admiration for what he called the most successful deception in the history of the Western timber trade. He acknowledged that his previous attempts to locate the source of the mysterious high-quality lumber had failed. He congratulated Caleb, referred to by name, his real name, on 15 years of maintaining a secret that most men couldn't have kept for 15 days. And then came the threat, wrapped in the velvet glove of business proposition. Ashworth was prepared to offer partnership. A generous arrangement that would allow Caleb to continue his operations with full Ashworth backing, capital, political protection, access to markets that remained closed to independent operators. In exchange, Ashworth would receive a 60% stake in all future revenues and full knowledge of the valley's location. The alternative, Ashworth wrote, would be unfortunate for everyone involved. He had resources that Caleb could not imagine. He had patience that Caleb could not outlast. And he had, most importantly, information that Caleb would not want made public. The letter ended with a date, 3 weeks from now, a meeting in Denver at Ashworth's offices where the terms of partnership would be finalized. Attendance was not optional. What information? Evelyn asked, looking up from the letter. What does he have? Caleb was staring out the window at the valley below, his profile sharp against the fading light. I don't know. I've been careful. 15 years of being careful. But Ashworth has been building his empire for 30 years. He has connections I can't even imagine. If he says he has information, he shook his head slowly. He's not bluffing. Then we need to find out what it is before the meeting. How? Evelyn set the letter down on the desk, her mind already racing through possibilities. The newspaper, the Rocky Mountain Herald. You said you have a connection there, someone who owes you favors. Journalists hear things. They have sources in places that businessmen don't. Martin Crane. He's the editor, but asking him to investigate Ashworth, Caleb turned from the window. That's not a small favor. Ashworth owns 3 newspapers himself. He's ruined journalists who crossed him. Then we don't ask him to investigate openly. We ask him to listen, to let us know if anyone's been asking questions, spreading rumors, building a case against you. Evelyn moved to stand beside him. What else? What other resources do we have? The freight company. Samuel Chen runs it. He's been my partner for 8 years. His drivers hear things, see things. If someone's been gathering information about my operations, there might be traces. Contact him, today. That writer is still here. Send him back with messages for both Crane and Chen. Caleb studied her face, something shifting in his expression. You're not afraid. I'm terrified. Evelyn held his gaze. But fear doesn't help us. Information does. Strategy does. We have 3 weeks, Caleb. That's not much time, but it's not nothing either. Let's use it. For a long moment, he simply looked at her. This woman he had married as a calculated risk. This stranger who had become something else entirely over the months they had spent learning each other. Then he reached out and took her hand, his grip firm and warm. What did I do to deserve you? You took a chance. She squeezed his hand back. Now let's make sure it was worth it. The next 3 weeks were the most intense of Evelyn's life. Messages flew back and forth between the Valley and Denver, carried by writers who understood the urgency but not the details. Martin Crane at the Herald began making quiet inquiries, using the careful methods of a man who knew how to gather information without revealing his interest. Samuel Chen put his freight drivers on alert, asking them to report anything unusual. Anyone asking questions about shipments, about sources, about a timber operation that seemed to exist only in rumors. And Evelyn, working late into the night in the study she now shared fully with Caleb, began building something she called their war map. It covered an entire wall of the study, papers pinned and connected with strings of different colors, each color representing a different type of relationship. Red for enemies, blue for allies, green for potential resources, yellow for unknown quantities. At the center was Victor Ashworth, surrounded by a web of connections that grew more complex with each passing day. He owns more than I thought, she said one evening, stepping back to survey the growing map. Railroads, obviously, but also mining operations in Nevada and Montana, timber interests in Oregon and Washington, a shipping company that controls half the freight moving through San Francisco Bay. I knew about most of that. Caleb stood beside her, his arms crossed. What's the yellow section? Politicians, judges, territorial officials, people who might be in his pocket but might also be persuadable if approached correctly. She pointed to one cluster of names. This is interesting. Judge William Harrington. He's on the Territorial Supreme Court, handles most of the land disputes that come through Denver. Ashworth has donated to his campaigns, but Harrington has also ruled against Ashworth interests twice in the past 3 years. So he's not completely bought. He's not completely anything. That's what makes him interesting. Evelyn turned to face Caleb. If we could get to him, not to corrupt him, but to make him aware of what Ashworth is doing, we might have someone in a position of actual power who could help us. Assuming we survive the meeting. Assuming that. She acknowledged the point with a slight nod. What do you think Ashworth actually wants? Not the official version, the real version. Caleb was quiet for a moment, his gaze fixed on the map. Control. That's what he always wants. He can't stand that something exists outside his reach. My valley isn't just timber to him, it's a symbol. Proof that someone can build something significant without his permission, without his involvement. He'd destroy it just to prove he could. Then why offer partnership? Why not just keep searching until he finds us? Because he's not certain he can find us. Not quickly, anyway. And time costs money, even for men like Ashworth. If he can get what he wants through negotiation, or intimidation, that's cleaner than a long campaign of investigation. So the meeting isn't really a negotiation, it's a test. Caleb nodded slowly. He wants to see what I'm made of, whether I can be bullied, whether I have weaknesses he can exploit. Then we need to make sure he doesn't see any weaknesses. Evelyn moved to her desk, pulling out a leather folder she had been compiling over the past weeks. I've been thinking about this, about how to approach the meeting. You could go alone, try to negotiate, see what he actually knows. But that puts you in a position of weakness, one man against his entire organization. What's the alternative? Take me with you. Caleb's eyebrows rose. Absolutely not. Hear me out. She opened the folder, spreading documents across the desk. Ashworth expects you to come alone, or maybe with 1 or 2 trusted men. He expects the poor mountain cowboy, the secretive hermit who's been hiding in the wilderness for 15 years. What he doesn't expect is a wife, a partner, someone who can hold her own in a conversation with men like him. That's exactly why I don't want you there. You'd become a target, something he could threaten. I'm already a target. Evelyn kept her voice steady. The moment you married me, I became part of this. If Ashworth wins, I lose everything too. The valley, the life we're building, all of it. I'd rather face him directly than wait here wondering what's happening. And if something goes wrong, if he decides to hold us both, use you as leverage, then we plan for that too. She met his eyes. Caleb, I've spent my whole life being protected, being sheltered from the hard decisions because I was a woman, because I was young, because men thought they knew better. You said you wanted a partner. This is what partnership looks like. Standing beside you when it's dangerous, not just when it's safe. The silence stretched between them. Evelyn could see the conflict in his face, the part of him that wanted to lock her safely in the valley, warring with the part that had married her precisely because she wasn't the kind of woman who would accept being locked away. You really believe you can help, he said finally, in that room with Ashworth and whoever else he brings. I believe we're stronger together than you are alone. I believe that showing up with a wife who understands his business, who can speak to his tactics, who isn't intimidated by his wealth, that changes the equation. It tells him you're not the isolated hermit he expected. It tells him you have resources he hasn't accounted for. And if he sees through that, if he realizes you're as new to this as you are, then I'll learn fast. Evelyn smiled slightly. I'm good at learning fast. You know that by now. Caleb stared at her for a long moment. Then slowly he shook his head, not in refusal, but in something like wonder. My father always said a man's greatest strength is the woman who stands beside him. I never understood what he meant until now. Is that a yes? It's a yes. He moved around the desk to stand before her, taking both her hands in his. We go together. We face him together. And whatever happens after that, we handle it. Together. Together, Evelyn agreed. They left for Denver 5 days before the scheduled meeting, traveling by a route that added a full day to the journey, but avoided any point where they might be observed and followed back to the valley. Caleb had transformed himself again. No longer the shabby cowboy, but something closer to what he actually was. His clothes were still practical, but they were the practical clothes of a successful businessman, not a struggling laborer. His horse was the best in his stable. His manner had shifted from quiet watchfulness to something more commanding, more assured. Evelyn, too, had prepared carefully. Mrs. Harlan had helped her alter 2 of the dresses that had arrived from a Denver seamstress over the past weeks. Not ostentatious, but well-made. The kind of clothes a prosperous man's wife would wear. The kind of clothes that said, I belong here without saying anything at all. They took rooms at the Windsor Hotel, Denver's finest, registering under Caleb's real name. Word would spread quickly, as Evelyn intended. Victor Ashworth would know within hours that Caleb Rowan had arrived early, that he had brought his wife, that he was not behaving like a man who feared the coming confrontation. The first test came the evening of their arrival. They were dining in the hotel restaurant, deliberately visible, deliberately calm. When a man approached their table, he was perhaps 50, well-dressed in the Eastern style, with silver hair and the kind of smile that never quite reached his eyes. Mr. Rowan, I presume. I'm Charles Whitmore. I represent certain interests that are eager to meet you. Caleb didn't rise. Mr. Ashworth's interests, I imagine. Among others. Whitmore's gaze slid to Evelyn with poorly disguised curiosity. I wasn't aware you would be bringing company. My wife goes where I go, Mr. Whitmore. I'm sure Mr. Ashworth understands the value of partnership. Something flickered in Whitmore's expression. Surprise, perhaps, at the steel beneath Caleb's calm tone. Of course. I merely wanted to welcome you to Denver and assure you that Mr. Ashworth is looking forward to your meeting. As am I. Caleb picked up his fork, a clear dismissal. Please give Mr. Ashworth my regards. Whitmore hesitated, clearly unused to being dismissed so casually. Then he inclined his head and withdrew, leaving them alone with their cooling dinners. That was deliberate, Evelyn said quietly. He was testing you. Testing us both. Caleb's eyes followed Whitmore's retreat across the restaurant, checking our composure, seeing how we react to unexpected pressure. And how did we do? Better than he expected. A ghost of a smile crossed Caleb's face. He'll report back that we're not easily rattled. That's exactly what we want Ashworth thinking before the real meeting. The remaining days before the meeting were filled with careful preparation. Evelyn met with Martin Crane at the Herald offices, a meeting arranged to look like a society call from a businessman's wife visiting the city. What she actually received was information, fragments and rumors, and half-heard whispers that Crane had gathered from his network of sources. Ashworth's been asking about land titles, Crane told her, his voice low despite the closed door of his office. Specifically, he's been researching the homestead claims filed in the high country over the past 20 years, looking for gaps, inconsistencies, anything that might give him legal grounds to challenge existing ownership. Does my husband have gaps in his documentation? I don't know what your husband has, Mrs. Rowan, but I know that Ashworth believes he's found something. His lawyers have been working around the clock for the past month. Whatever he plans to present at this meeting, it's not just intimidation. He thinks he has a legal case. Evelyn carried this information back to Caleb, who received it with grim understanding. The original claim, he said, pacing the floor of their hotel room. When I first found the valley, I filed under a false name, multiple false names actually, to make sure no single identity could be traced to the entire property. Could he prove those names are false? If he's traced far enough back, Caleb stopped pacing. There's a birth record in Kansas for a child who died before his first birthday. I used his name for one of the early claims. If Ashworth has found that record, found proof the child died, then one of your claims is invalid, built on fraud, and everything that flows from it, the timber rights, the water rights, the buildings, all of it, could be challenged in court. Evelyn felt the weight of this settling over them both. This was Ashworth's weapon, not just intimidation but legal leverage, the threat of years of court battles, of their secrets dragged into public record, of everything they had built being dismantled piece by piece through the machinery of law. We need to know for certain what he has, she said, before the meeting. How? The same way he gathered information on us. We find someone who knows, someone in his organization who might be willing to talk. Ashworth's people are loyal, bought and paid for. Everyone has a price, Caleb. You taught me that. The question is finding the right currency. She moved to the window, looking out over Denver's gas-lit streets. Whitmore, the man who approached us at dinner. He's Ashworth's messenger, which means he's trusted enough to know the details but not important enough to be irreplaceable. Men like that sometimes have grievances they don't show their employers. You want to approach him? I want to observe him, find out what he cares about, see if there's an angle we haven't considered. She turned back to face Caleb. The meeting is in 2 days. That's not much time, but it might be enough. Caleb studied her for a long moment, that same expression of wonder she had seen before. When did you learn to think like this? When I realized that thinking any other way would get us killed. The intelligence came through Samuel Chen's network, not from Whitmore directly, but from a freight driver who had overheard a conversation in a Denver warehouse. Whitmore had a son, a young man with gambling debts and expensive habits, debts that Ashworth had been covering in exchange for the father's continued loyalty. But the son had gotten in too deep recently, owed money to men who wouldn't wait for Ashworth's schedule. Whitmore was desperate, trying to find a way to pay off his son's creditors without Ashworth discovering the full extent of the problem. It's not much, Caleb said, reading Chen's hastily written note, but it's something. It's leverage. Evelyn took the note from his hand. Not to blackmail him. That would just make him an enemy. But if we could help him, quietly, before the meeting, he might remember that kindness. You want to pay off his son's debts? I want to solve his problem, whatever that takes. She met Caleb's eyes. How much can we afford to spend on goodwill? The answer, it turned out, was more than Evelyn had expected. Caleb's hidden bank accounts held reserves she hadn't fully appreciated, enough to pay Whitmore's son's gambling debts twice over and still maintain their other resources. The money was transferred through one of Chen's contacts, with a note that revealed nothing about its source except that it came from a friend who understands the difficulties of family. Whether Whitmore would connect this anonymous generosity to the Rowans remained to be seen. But when they arrived at Ashworth's offices on the appointed day, there was something different in Whitmore's eyes, a flicker of uncertainty. of debt, of something that looked almost like gratitude. Victor Ashworth's offices occupied the top floor of the tallest building in Denver, a monument to his own importance that offered views of the entire city and the mountains beyond. The room where he received them was paneled in dark wood, furnished with leather chairs that probably cost more than most families earned in a year. Everything about it was designed to intimidate. Ashworth himself was smaller than Evelyn had expected, a compact man in his 60s with white hair and eyes the color of wet slate. He rose when they entered, his gaze moving from Caleb to Evelyn and back again with the quick assessment of a man used to reading people like balance sheets. "Mr. Rowan, thank you for accepting my invitation." His voice was soft, cultured, with an Eastern accent that spoke of old money and older power. "And Mrs. Rowan, I confess I didn't expect you. My wife is my partner, Mr. Ashworth, in all things." "How modern." Ashworth gestured to the chairs arranged before his desk. "Please, sit. We have much to discuss." They sat. Whitmore took a position by the door, his face carefully neutral. Two other men were present, lawyers, Evelyn guessed, from their attentive postures and the folders of documents they held. "I'll be direct," Ashworth began, settling into his own chair with the comfort of a king assuming his throne. "I know what you've built, Mr. Rowan, not where precisely, but what. A timber empire hidden in the high country, operating for 15 years under a web of false names and careful misdirection. It's impressive, truly. But it can't continue." "Can't it?" "No." Ashworth folded his hands on the desk before him. "The West is changing, Mr. Rowan. The days of individual operators carving out their own territories are ending. The future belongs to organized capital, to corporations with the resources to develop land efficiently, to bring civilization to the wilderness. Your little kingdom is an anachronism, a relic of a world that's already disappearing. And you represent this glorious future, I take it." "I represent reality." Ashworth's slate eyes were cold. "I'm offering you a place in that reality, a partnership that would preserve what you've built while bringing it into the modern age. The alternative—" He gestured to one of the lawyers, who stepped forward and placed a folder on the desk. "The alternative is considerably less pleasant." Caleb didn't touch the folder. Neither did Evelyn. "Perhaps you could summarize what's in there," Evelyn said, speaking for the first time. "Save us all some reading." Ashworth's eyes narrowed slightly, reassessing her. "Your husband filed land claims in the Colorado High Country using at least 3 different identities. One of those identities, David Mercer, is particularly interesting. David Mercer was born in Leavenworth, Kansas in 1852. He died of scarlet fever before his first birthday. The land claims filed under his name are therefore fraudulent. Every timber right, water right, and property deed that flows from those claims could be invalidated by any competent court in the territory." The room fell silent. Evelyn felt Caleb tense beside her, though his face revealed nothing. "That's a serious accusation," she said calmly. "I assume you have proof?" "I have documentation that would convince a judge." Ashworth smiled without warmth. "But I have no desire to pursue legal action, Mrs. Rowan. Court battles are expensive, time-consuming, and uncertain. I much prefer negotiated solutions. Solutions where you get 60% of everything my husband has built. Solutions where your husband gets to keep building with all the resources and protection my organization can provide." Ashworth spread his hands. "Think of it as insurance, against legal challenges, against competitors, against all the uncertainties that plague independent operators in these changing times. And if we decline your insurance, then I file the fraudulent claim documentation with the territorial court tomorrow morning. Your husband's entire operation becomes the subject of legal proceedings that will take years to resolve. In the meantime, no reputable buyer will touch his lumber. No bank will extend credit. No business partner will risk association with potentially invalid property rights." Ashworth's smile widened. "I don't need to destroy you, Mr. Rowan. I just need to freeze you in place until you have no choice but to accept my terms." Evelyn glanced at Caleb, whose gray eyes had gone hard as granite. She could see him calculating options, measuring responses, searching for a way through this trap. She spoke before he could. "You've done your research, Mr. Ashworth, but you've missed something important." Ashworth's attention shifted to her. his expression tolerant in the way of men who humored women's opinions before dismissing them. Have I? You've assumed that exposure is your only leverage, that the threat of legal action is enough to force our compliance. Evelyn kept her voice steady, conversational, as if discussing the weather rather than the destruction of everything they had built. But you haven't considered what we might be willing to expose in return. Mrs. Rowan, the water rights in the Montana Territory, your acquisition of the Riverside Mining Company's claims after their majority shareholder died under unusual circumstances, the federal land grants that somehow ended up in your possession after the Territorial Assessor's Office lost certain documentation. Evelyn smiled pleasantly. You're not the only one who's done research, Mr. Ashworth. The room had gone very still. Ashworth's face had lost some of its confident composure, replaced by something colder, more calculating. Those are serious allegations, Mrs. Rowan. They're public record, scattered across a dozen newspapers and court filings, none of them connected enough to draw attention individually. But collected together, organized into a coherent narrative, presented to the right journalists or political investigators. She shrugged elegantly. Legal battles work both ways, Mr. Ashworth. You might be able to freeze our operation, but we could make your life significantly more complicated in the process. You're bluffing. Perhaps. Or perhaps we've spent the past 3 weeks preparing for exactly this conversation, gathering documentation, making copies in secure locations, establishing relationships with journalists who would find your business history newsworthy. Ashworth's eyes moved between Evelyn and Caleb, reassessing the equation he had thought he understood. Whitmore, by the door, had gone very pale. This is not how I expected this conversation to proceed, Ashworth said finally. No, Caleb spoke for the first time since Evelyn had taken over. I imagine it isn't. You expected to find a mountain cowboy, isolated and vulnerable, grateful for whatever terms you offered. What you found instead is a partnership, one that won't be bullied into submission. A partnership. Ashworth repeated the word as if tasting it. You speak as if you have equal standing in this room, as if your handful of documents and journalist contacts could actually threaten an organization I've spent 30 years building. We speak as if we have nothing to lose. Evelyn met his slate eyes without flinching. You've made it clear you intend to destroy us if we don't comply. What possible reason do we have to hold anything back? If we're going down, Mr. Ashworth, we're taking as much of your operation with us as we can manage. That would be suicide. That would be survival. She leaned forward slightly. But here's the thing, Mr. Ashworth. We don't actually want a war. Wars are expensive for everyone involved, even the winners. We'd much prefer a different kind of arrangement. What kind of arrangement? Evelyn glanced at Caleb, who gave a slight nod. They had discussed this possibility late into the night, planning for exactly this moment. A true partnership, Evelyn said. Not the one you proposed, where you take 60% and call yourself our protector. A genuine business relationship, where we supply high-quality lumber to your operations at agreed-upon prices, where you provide distribution networks and political cover, where both sides profit from the arrangement. I already have lumber suppliers. None as good as ours. You know that, or you wouldn't have spent 12 years trying to find where it comes from. Evelyn held his gaze. We're offering you access to the best timber in the territory without having to know where it grows. The location stays secret, the operation stays under our control, but you get a reliable, exclusive supply relationship that your competitors can't match. And in return, you destroy your documentation about the David Mercer claims. You stop searching for our valley. You use your political connections to ensure our operation isn't interfered with by territorial authorities. She paused. And we both pretend this meeting ended with a handshake instead of a war. The silence stretched. Ashworth's fingers drummed slowly on his desktop, his eyes never leaving Evelyn's face. You're not what I expected, Mrs. Rowan. I'm told I rarely am. Something that might have been amusement flickered across his features. He turned to Caleb. Your wife drives a hard bargain. She does. Caleb's voice was even. But she's also right. There's a deal here that benefits both of us. The only question is whether you're willing to take it. Ashworth was quiet for a long moment, the clockwork of his mind almost visible behind those slate eyes. Then, slowly, he stood. I need time to consider your proposal. The terms you've outlined are unconventional. We're unconventional people. Evelyn rose as well, followed by Caleb. We're staying at the Windsor. You know how to reach us. Indeed I do. Ashworth extended his hand to Evelyn, not to Caleb. It's been an education, Mrs. Rowan. Whatever else happens, I'll remember this conversation. Evelyn shook his hand firmly. So will I, Mr. Ashworth. So will I. They left his office without looking back, walking through the outer rooms and down the marble staircase with the unhurried pace of people who had nothing to fear. It wasn't until they were in the hired carriage, rattling through Denver's crowded streets toward the Windsor, that Evelyn allowed herself to breathe. That was either the bravest or the stupidest thing I've ever done, she said quietly. Caleb reached over and took her hand, his grip warm and strong. It was brilliant. His voice was rough with emotion. You were brilliant. I've never seen anyone handle Ashworth like that. He expected me to come begging. Instead, he got you, holding a knife to his reputation and smiling while you did it. We don't actually have all that documentation, not organized the way I implied. He doesn't know that, and by the time he figures it out, we'll have gathered enough that the threat is real. Caleb shook his head slowly. Evelyn, what you did in there, you changed everything. The whole balance of power shifted because you refused to be intimidated. I was terrified. I know, I could feel you shaking beside me. He lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss against her fingers. That's what makes it brave, doing what needs doing even when you're scared to death. The carriage rolled on through the evening streets, carrying them toward whatever came next. Evelyn leaned against her husband's shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of him, the strength she had come to rely on over these past months. They weren't safe. They might never be truly safe, but they had proven something today, to Ashworth and to themselves. They were not prey. They were partners, forged in crisis, tempered by fire, ready for whatever battles lay ahead. And somewhere in the hidden valley of the high country, their empire waited for them to return. Ashworth's response came 3 days later, not through official channels, but through a private note delivered to their hotel room by a messenger who disappeared before he could be questioned. The terms were acceptable with modifications, a 40-60 split in Ashworth's favor instead of the equal partnership Evelyn had proposed, but with guaranteed prices and protected territory rights that made the arrangement genuinely valuable. More importantly, Ashworth agreed to destroy the documentation about the fraudulent land claims and cease all investigation into the valley's location. It was not victory, exactly, but it was survival on their own terms. Caleb and Evelyn signed the agreement in Ashworth's office the following morning, with lawyers present and documents notarized and every legal formality observed. Ashworth was cordial throughout, his earlier hostility replaced by something that resembled respect, the way a predator might regard another predator who had proven unexpectedly dangerous. You understand this doesn't make us friends, he said, as they shook hands over the completed paperwork. It makes us business partners. There's a difference. I understand perfectly, Evelyn replied. Friends trust each other. Business partners verify. Ashworth laughed, a genuine sound of amusement that transformed his severe features briefly. I'm going to enjoy doing business with you, Mrs. Rowan. You're the most interesting thing to happen in Denver in years. They rode back to the valley through summer gold meadows and forests thick with the scent of pine, following the hidden trails that Caleb knew by heart. The journey felt different this time. Not the tense passage into an unknown future that had marked Evelyn's first crossing of these mountains, but something closer to homecoming. The valley was waiting for them, and it was still theirs. Mrs. Harlan met them at the door of the main house, her sharp eyes scanning their faces for news before they could speak a word. Well, she demanded, abandoning formality in her urgency. What happened? We won, Evelyn said simply, or at least we didn't lose. The celebration that night was quiet but genuine. Good food and better company. The people of the valley gathered in the main house to hear what had happened in Denver and what it meant for their future. Caleb told the story plainly, without embellishment, but every person present understood what they had narrowly avoided. When he described how Evelyn had faced down Ashworth, turning the meeting from surrender to negotiation through sheer force of will, There were murmurs of appreciation that made Evelyn's cheeks warm. "To Mrs. Rowan," Sam Garrett raised his cup. "Who walked into the dragon's den and made it blink." "To the valley," Evelyn countered, "and everyone who helped build it." Later, when the celebration had wound down and the house had grown quiet, Evelyn and Caleb sat together on the porch, watching stars emerge above the dark shoulders of the mountains. The summer air was soft, fragrant with wildflowers and cooling pine. "You're different," Caleb said after a long silence. Evelyn turned to look at him. "What do you mean?" "When I first brought you here, you were adapting, learning, watching everything with those sharp eyes, figuring out how the pieces fit together." He reached over and took her hand. "Now you're not just adapting, you're shaping things, making decisions, becoming part of the foundation." "Is that a problem?" "It's a miracle." His voice was rough with emotion. "I spent 15 years building this place, Evelyn. 15 years alone, trusting no one completely, keeping everyone at arm's length because that was the only way to stay safe. And then you walked in, and within months you're negotiating with Victor Ashworth like you were born to it." "I was scared the entire time." "I know. That's what makes it remarkable." He turned to face her fully, his gray eyes catching starlight. "I married you because I needed a partner. What I didn't expect was to find this." "This?" "Someone who makes me want to be more than I've been. Someone who sees possibilities I missed. Someone who—" He stopped, seeming to struggle with words that didn't come easily to a man who had spent so long guarding his inner self. "Someone who what, Caleb?" "Someone I'm falling in love with." The words hung in the night air between them, fragile and momentous. Evelyn felt her heart beating against her ribs, felt the weight of what he had just admitted settling into her bones. "This wasn't supposed to happen," she said quietly. "We had an arrangement, a practical exchange." "I know." "Love wasn't part of the bargain." "I know." He didn't look away. "But here we are anyway. Unless I've completely misread things, unless this is just business to you." Evelyn thought about the woman she had been 6 months ago, standing at her cabin window in a dying settlement, watching the coffin maker work, counting the days until everything fell apart. She thought about the choice she had made, the stranger she had married, the terrifying leap into darkness that had somehow landed her here, on this porch, under these stars, with this man looking at her like she was the answer to questions he had been asking his whole life. "It's not just business," she said. "I don't know when it stopped being that. Somewhere between the account books and the war maps and facing down Ashworth together. But it's not just business anymore." "What is it then?" She reached up and touched his face, the weathered skin, the lines that spoke of years in sun and wind, the jaw that could set so stubbornly when he was determined. "I think it's the beginning of something neither of us planned for." "And that doesn't frighten you?" "Everything about this frightens me." She smiled slightly. "But I've learned that being frightened doesn't mean I have to stop moving forward." He kissed her then, beneath the stars, with the mountains keeping watch all around them. It was not the chaste kiss he had pressed to her forehead at their wedding. It was something deeper, something that had been building through months of shared danger and growing trust. When they finally broke apart, Evelyn was trembling, not from fear this time, but from the overwhelming recognition that everything between them had just changed. "I think," Caleb said softly, "that this might be the best business deal I ever made." Evelyn laughed, a surprised, joyful sound she barely recognized. "You're a romantic after all, Caleb Rowan. Who would have guessed?" "Don't tell anyone. I have a reputation to maintain. Your secret is safe with me." She leaned into him, feeling his arm wrap around her shoulders, feeling for the first time that she truly belonged here, not just in the valley, but with him. "All your secrets are safe with me." The autumn that followed was the most peaceful time the valley had known in years. With the Ashworth agreement in place, the constant tension of discovery eased. Caleb and his people could focus on what they did best: harvesting timber sustainably, maintaining the land, building for a future that finally seemed secure. The fall shipments went out on schedule, fetching the guaranteed prices that Ashworth's network commanded. Money flowed into accounts that had been stretched thin by years of defensive preparation. Evelyn threw herself into expanding the improvements she had begun the previous spring. The network of allies and informants that had helped them gather intelligence on Ashworth was formalized into something more permanent, a web of relationships throughout the territory that could provide early warning of threats and opportunities alike. She continued her correspondence with Martin Crane at the Herald, cultivating a friendship that provided valuable insight into the political currents flowing through Denver. She maintained contact with Samuel Chen's freight operation, ensuring they always knew what was moving through the territory and who was moving it. "You're building an empire," Caleb said one evening, watching her work at her desk in the study. "Not of timber, of information." "Information is power." Evelyn didn't look up from the letter she was composing. "Your father understood that physical resources could be taken. That's why he learned to protect what he had. But information is different. It can't be seized, can't be destroyed, can't be controlled by force. The man with the most information makes the best decisions." "Woman." Now she looked up, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "What?" "The woman with the most information. In this case, anyway." Flattery. But she was pleased, and they both knew it. The transformation in their marriage was quieter than the changes in their business, but no less profound. What had begun as an arrangement of convenience had deepened into genuine partnership, and what had grown into partnership was blossoming into love. They still worked side by side during the days, still plotted strategy and reviewed accounts, and managed the complex machinery of the valley's operations. But the evenings belonged to them alone. Quiet hours on the porch watching sunset paint the mountains, conversations that ranged from philosophy to practical planning to memories of childhoods that had shaped them both. Caleb told her about his mother, the schoolteacher from Philadelphia who had followed his father into the wilderness because she believed in his vision of what the West could become. She had died when Caleb was 12, a fever that swept through their small settlement and took a third of its population. His father had never recovered, had spent the next 20 years building and building, as if enough logs stacked together could somehow fill the void she had left. "He died still building," Caleb said, his voice rough. "Heart gave out while he was supervising the construction of the mill. I found him lying in the sawdust, looking almost peaceful, like he had finally finished what he set out to do." "Is that what you're afraid of?" Evelyn asked softly. "Dying before you finish?" "I used to be." He turned to look at her in the firelight. "Now I'm more afraid of not living, of spending so much time protecting what I have that I forget to actually enjoy it." "Then let's enjoy it." She took his hand. Together. Winter came early that year, the first snows falling in late October and settling in for a long stay. The valley transformed into a world of white and gray and the dark green of pine boughs heavy with ice. The cutting operations wound down, the men returning to the main settlement for the cold months, the pace of life slowing to match the shorter days. It was during one of those long winter evenings that Evelyn realized she was pregnant. She had suspected for weeks the subtle changes in her body, the nausea that came and went, the exhaustion that no amount of sleep seemed to cure. But it wasn't until Mrs. Harlan caught her swaying dizzily in the kitchen one morning and fixed her with those sharp blue eyes that Evelyn admitted what she had been avoiding. "How far along?" Mrs. Harlan asked, her voice matter-of-fact. "I'm not certain. 2 months, perhaps 3. "Does Mr. Rowan know?" "Not yet." Mrs. Harlan nodded once, as if this was a problem with a clear solution. "Tell him tonight. He deserves to know, and you deserve not to carry this alone," she told him after dinner, sitting together in the warmth of the main room while the fire crackled and wind howled outside the windows. She had rehearsed the words a dozen times, but when the moment came, they fled her mind, leaving only the simple truth. "I'm going to have a baby." Caleb went very still. His face, usually so carefully controlled, betrayed a cascade of emotions. Shock, then fear, then something that looked almost like wonder. "You're certain?" "As certain as I can be. Mrs. Harlan thinks so too." "A baby." He said the word as if he had never heard it before. "Our baby. Our baby." Evelyn felt tears prickling at her eyes. Joy and terror mingled together in equal measure. "I know we didn't plan for this. I know there's still so much uncertainty, so many things we're still building, but she didn't get to finish the sentence. Caleb crossed the distance between them in 2 strides, pulling her into his arms with a fierceness that stole her breath. "A baby," he said again, his voice thick with emotion. "Evelyn, do you understand what this means? It means we're going to be parents. It means everything I've built, everything we've built. It's not just for us anymore. It's for someone who doesn't even exist yet, someone who will inherit all of this." He pulled back to look at her face, his gray eyes bright with unshed tears. "It means we're building a legacy now, not just an empire." The pregnancy progressed through the winter months with the same mixture of anxiety and wonder that marked all first pregnancies. Evelyn continued her work, the correspondence, the planning, the endless details that kept the valley running, but she found herself thinking more and more about the future. Not the immediate future of shipments and schedules and potential threats, but the distant future, the world her child would grow up in, the choices that child would face. "What do we tell them?" she asked Caleb one night, her hand resting on the growing curve of her belly. "When they're old enough to understand, about how all this began, about what we've done to protect it." "We tell them the truth." Caleb's hand covered hers. That their father was a man who built something from nothing and protected it the only way he knew how. That their mother was a woman brave enough to face down dragons and smart enough to turn enemies into allies. That together, we created something worth passing on. Even the hard parts, the false names, the hidden valley, the enemies we've made, especially those parts. His voice was firm. Our child needs to understand that the world isn't simple, that sometimes protecting what you love requires compromises. That strength isn't about avoiding difficult choices, it's about making them and living with the consequences. Spring arrived in a rush of snowmelt and new growth, the valley shaking off winter's grip like a sleeper waking from long rest. The cutting crews returned to work. The mill wheel began turning again. Life resumed its purposeful rhythm. And with spring came word that Victor Ashworth was dying. The news arrived through Martin Crane's network, a brief note indicating that the great railroad magnate had suffered a seizure in March and was not expected to survive the summer. His empire, built over decades of ruthless acquisition, was already beginning to fragment as his lieutenants positioned themselves for the inevitable succession struggle. "What does this mean for us?" Evelyn asked, reading the letter for the 3rd time. "Our agreement was with Ashworth personally. If he dies, it means uncertainty." Caleb stood at the window, watching spring rain streak across the glass. "The agreement should survive him legally, but whether his successors will honor it depends on who takes control. Whitmore? Maybe? Or one of the others. There are 6 men who have been waiting for Ashworth to die so they can divide up his holdings. Then we need to prepare." Evelyn set down the letter, her mind already racing through possibilities. "We need to know who the likely successors are, what they want, how they might view our arrangement. We need contingency plans. We need to be careful." Caleb turned from the window. "You're 7 months pregnant, Evelyn. Whatever plans we make, they can't depend on you traveling to Denver or taking the kinds of risks you took last year." "I know my limitations." She kept her voice even, though his protectiveness both touched and frustrated her. "But I can still think. I can still plan. I can still write letters and gather information and prepare for whatever comes next. I'm not suggesting otherwise." He crossed to her, taking her hands in his. "I'm suggesting that we handle this together, but differently than before. I can be the face of our operations in the outside world while you manage things from here. We don't both need to be in the line of fire." It was a reasonable position, practically speaking, but something in Evelyn rebelled against the idea of retreating to the safety of the valley while Caleb faced potential enemies alone. "If there's a crisis," she said carefully, "I want to be there, whatever state I'm in. If there's a crisis, I want you safe, whatever state you're in." They stared at each other, the immovable force meeting the unstoppable object. Then Evelyn sighed. "We'll see what happens. Make decisions as circumstances require." "Fair enough." He kissed her forehead. "I just want you to know that protecting you isn't about doubting your abilities. It's about understanding that some things matter more than any business advantage." Victor Ashworth died in late May, as the wildflowers were painting the valley floor in colors that seemed to celebrate life even as death claimed the man who had been their greatest enemy. Word spread quickly through the territory. The Titan was gone, and the scramble for his legacy had begun. Within days, Caleb was receiving letters from 3 different factions within the former Ashworth organization, each presenting themselves as the legitimate heir to the business relationships the old man had maintained. 2 of the letters threatened to void the existing agreement unless new terms were negotiated immediately. The third, surprisingly, came from Charles Whitmore. His note was brief and carefully worded, expressing condolences on the disruption that Ashworth's death must be causing to their business relationship. But between the formal phrases, Evelyn could read a different message entirely. Whitmore was positioning himself as an ally, someone who understood the value of what Caleb had built and wanted to preserve it. "The gambling debts," she said, looking up from the letter. "He remembers who paid them." "Maybe." Caleb frowned. "Or maybe he's just being strategic. Whitmore was always the smartest of Ashworth's people. He knows that maintaining our supply relationship is more valuable than starting a war over new terms. Either way, we should respond carefully, encourage his loyalty without promising anything we can't deliver." "Agreed. I'll draft something." "We'll draft something." Evelyn smiled slightly at his raised eyebrow. "I may not be traveling to Denver, but I can certainly still compose a letter." The succession struggle resolved more quickly than anyone expected. By midsummer, Whitmore had consolidated control of the core Ashworth holdings, outmaneuvering his rivals through a combination of legal strategy and strategic alliances. He sent word that he intended to honor all existing agreements, including the one with Caleb Rowan. "He's not Ashworth," Caleb said, reading Whitmore's formal communication. "He doesn't have the old man's ambition to control everything. He just wants to run a profitable business. That makes him easier to work with. Much easier. Ashworth would have used any crisis as an excuse to renegotiate. Whitmore just wants stability." The relief that flooded through Evelyn was physical, a tension she hadn't realized she was carrying finally releasing. They had weathered another storm. Their arrangement would continue. The valley was safe, or as safe as it had ever been. Her labor began on a night in late August, with a thunderstorm rolling through the mountains and lightning splitting the darkness above the peaks. Mrs. Harlan had been preparing for weeks, gathering supplies and clearing one of the upstairs rooms and issuing instructions to the household staff with the efficiency of a general preparing for battle. Caleb paced the hallway outside the room like a caged animal, forbidden by Mrs. Harlan from entering until called, driving himself nearly mad with worry at every sound from behind the closed door. 18 hours later, as dawn broke over the eastern ridges, the sound he had been waiting for finally came, the thin, sharp cry of a newborn entering the world. Mrs. Harlan opened the door, her usual severity softened by something that looked almost like joy. "You can come in now, Mr. Rowan. Come meet your daughter." His daughter. Caleb walked into the room on legs that barely seemed to work, his eyes going immediately to the bed where Evelyn lay propped against pillows, exhausted and radiant, holding a small bundled form against her chest. "Come see her," Evelyn said, her voice hoarse but warm. "Come see what we made together." He approached slowly, almost reverently, looking down at the tiny face peeking from the blankets. The baby's eyes were closed, her fists curled against her cheeks, her whole body no larger than his forearm. She was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. "She's perfect," he whispered. "She's ours." Evelyn looked up at him with tears streaming down her face. "Whatever happens next, Caleb, whatever challenges we face, we did this. We created this." He sat on the edge of the bed, his arm going around Evelyn, his other hand reaching down to touch, so gently, his daughter's tiny hand. The fingers curled instinctively around his, and something in his chest broke open, spilling warmth through every part of him. "What do we call her?" he asked. Evelyn smiled. "I was thinking Margaret, after Mrs. Harlan. Without her, I'm not sure either of us would have made it through these past few months." From somewhere behind them, Mrs. Harlan made a sound that might have been surprise or emotion, or both. "You don't have to. We want to." Caleb looked over his shoulder at the woman who had run his household for 11 years, who had welcomed Evelyn when she arrived as a stranger, who had guided them both through the maze of becoming a family. Margaret Rowan, if you'll allow it. Mrs. Harlan's severe face crumpled briefly before she regained control. I'd be honored, Mr. Rowan, truly honored. Little Margaret, Maggie, they started calling her almost immediately, thrived in the mountain air. She had her mother's auburn hair and her father's gray eyes, and a disposition that seemed to combine the best of both parents, Evelyn's quick intelligence and Caleb's patient watchfulness. Within weeks, she had become the center of the household, adored by everyone from the cutting crews to the mill workers to old Cooper the bookkeeper, who carved her a set of wooden blocks and spent hours showing her how to stack them. She's going to be remarkable, Evelyn said one evening, watching Maggie sleep in her cradle by the fire. I can already tell. With you as her mother? Of course she will be. Caleb stood behind her, his arms wrapped around her waist, both of them gazing at their daughter. She'll grow up in a world we're building for her, a world where she can be whatever she wants to be. A world we're still building, Evelyn corrected gently. We're not done yet. No. He pressed a kiss to her temple. But we're closer than we were, and we're building it together. Outside the windows, autumn was painting the valley in gold and crimson. The timber crews were preparing for the fall cutting season. The mill was running at capacity. Somewhere in Denver, Charles Whitmore was managing the business relationship that protected them from the outside world. And in the hidden valley, surrounded by mountains that had guarded its secrets for 15 years, a family was taking root. The girl who had sold herself for the price of her father's coffin had become something she never imagined. A wife, a mother, a partner in an empire built on sustainability and secrecy and stubborn determination. She had married survival, and she had found so much more. 5 years passed in the hidden valley like water flowing over stones, sometimes rushing, sometimes gentle, always moving forward, always shaping the landscape it touched. Maggie grew from a bundle in a cradle to a bright-eyed child who raced through the meadows and asked questions that made grown men pause to think. She had inherited her mother's sharp mind and her father's quiet observation, watching the world around her with eyes that seemed to understand far more than her years should allow. By the time she was 4, she knew the names of every worker in the valley. By 5, she could explain in simple terms how the mill converted logs to lumber, how the accounting books tracked every board foot, how the hidden trails kept their homes safe from the outside world. She's going to run this place someday, Sam Garrett said one afternoon, watching Maggie explain to a new worker how the water wheel worked. Better than any of us, I'd wager. Evelyn smiled, pride warming her chest. She'll have the chance to choose what she wants. That's all we've ever worked for. The valley itself had transformed over those 5 years, growing from a hidden fortress into something closer to a genuine community. New families had arrived, carefully vetted, thoroughly trusted, bringing children who became Maggie's playmates and friends. A schoolhouse had been built near the main settlement, where Evelyn taught reading and arithmetic and history 3 mornings a week, passing on the education that had once seemed useless in a dying mountain settlement. The business had grown too, though always carefully, always sustainably. Their partnership with Whitmore's organization had proved more valuable than anyone had anticipated. Charles Whitmore, it turned out, shared many of Caleb's principles about responsible resource management. Together, they had developed a model for sustainable timber harvesting that was beginning to attract attention from conservation-minded politicians and journalists throughout the territory. We're not hiding anymore, Caleb observed one evening, reviewing correspondence from a territorial senator who had expressed interest in their methods. Not completely, anyway. We're choosing what to reveal and what to protect. Evelyn looked up from her own work, a letter to Martin Crane about an upcoming article in the Herald that would discuss sustainable forestry without mentioning the valley's location. That's different from hiding. Is it? It is. Hiding is about fear. This is about strategy. We're building influence, Caleb, shaping the conversation about how the West should develop, making it harder for men like the old Ashworth to strip the land bare without consequence. Caleb was quiet for a moment, considering this. My father would have hated it, he said finally. All this exposure, all these connections to the outside world. He believed safety only came from isolation. And look how well that served him. He died alone, Caleb, building a fortress that no one could share. Evelyn set down her pen. We're building something different, something that can survive because people believe in it, not just because they can't find it. You've changed me. He said it without complaint, a simple fact. The man I was when I found you in Ridgecrest, he couldn't have imagined this, any of this. I haven't changed you. I've helped you become more of who you always wanted to be. She crossed the room to stand before him, taking his hands in hers. The vision was always yours, Caleb. The valley, the sustainable harvesting, the community you've built here. All I did was help you see that it could survive in the daylight, not just the shadows. The challenge, when it came, arrived not from old enemies, but from new circumstances. The railroad was coming west. Word had been building for months. Surveys conducted in the passes, engineers mapping potential routes, land agents buying up property along projected corridors. The transcontinental connection that had seemed like distant fantasy a decade ago was becoming reality, and its iron tracks would reshape everything they had built. The main line will pass 50 miles south of us, Caleb said, spreading survey maps across the study desk. But they're planning a spur line through the northern passes for the mining operations in Summit County. Evelyn studied the maps, her mind already calculating implications. That puts them within 30 miles of the valley, close enough that someone might stumble on our trails, close enough that our lumber shipments become visible to anyone watching the railroad traffic, close enough that hiding might not be possible anymore. The words hung in the air between them, the acknowledgement of a threat they had always known might come but had hoped to avoid. What are our options? Evelyn asked. We could try to buy the land along the potential route, create a buffer zone that we control. Can we afford that? Maybe. It would stretch our reserves, and it might draw attention. Someone would notice if a mysterious buyer suddenly acquired thousands of acres in the path of the railroad. What else? Caleb was quiet for a long moment. We could go public. File proper claims under our real names. Stop pretending the valley doesn't exist and start defending it through legal channels instead of secrecy. Evelyn felt her breath catch. Going public meant exposure. It meant vulnerability. It meant trusting that the legal protections and political connections they had built over 5 years would be enough to protect them from anyone who might want to take what they had. But it also meant freedom. No more false names, no more elaborate deceptions, no more living in fear that a single discovery could bring everything crashing down. Could we do it? She asked. Legally? With the original claims filed under false identities? I've had Cooper looking into it. Caleb pulled another folder from his desk. The homestead laws have changed since I first filed. There are provisions now for correcting fraudulent claims if the actual occupant can demonstrate continuous improvement and good faith development of the land. It wouldn't be simple, but it might be possible. And the Ashworth documentation? The proof that the David Mercer claims were invalid? Whitmore destroyed it, as agreed. And even if copies exist somewhere, 5 years of legitimate business operations and political connections make us harder to attack than we were before. Evelyn turned back to the maps, tracing the projected railroad route with her finger. If we go public, we lose the security of anonymity, but we gain legal standing, political voice, the ability to fight for what we've built through courts and legislatures instead of shadows and secrets. It's a risk. Everything we've ever done has been a risk. She looked up at him, remembering the woman she had been when they first met, desperate, cornered, with no good choices and no hope for the future. The question is whether it's a risk worth taking. They spent weeks discussing it, planning it, preparing for every contingency they could imagine. They consulted with lawyers in Denver, with politicians who had become allies, with Martin Crane and Samuel Chen and every member of their carefully built network. The consensus was cautious but encouraging. Going public was possible, advisable even, given the changing landscape of Western development. The hardest conversation was with the people of the valley. Caleb called a meeting in the main house, gathering everyone who had made this hidden community their home. The room was crowded with faces Evelyn had come to know as family. Sam Garrett and his crew, Marcus from the mill, Elena the trail guide, old Cooper with his accounting books, Mrs. Harlan standing near the door with Maggie in her arms. They had all come here seeking safety, seeking a fresh start away from whatever had driven them from the outside world. You all know why we're here, Caleb began, his voice carrying through the hushed room. The railroad is coming. The world is changing around us. The question is how we respond. He explained the options, the buffer zone that might buy time, the legal path that would require exposure, the risks and potential benefits of each approach. He spoke clearly, honestly, hiding nothing about the dangers they faced or the uncertainties that lay ahead. Whatever we decide, he concluded, we decide together. This valley belongs to all of us. Your voices matter. The room fell silent. Then Sam Garrett stepped forward, his weathered face thoughtful. I came here 12 years ago, he said slowly, running from a mining company that had cheated me out of everything I owned. I didn't believe there was any place left where a man could start over, where the powerful couldn't reach. He looked around the room at the assembled community. This valley proved me wrong. What we've built here, it's worth protecting, worth fighting for. But fighting how? Elena spoke up, her voice carrying the accent of her Santa Fe childhood. I came here because I was running too. From a man who would have killed me if he found me. If we go public, if everyone knows where this place is. You're protected here, Evelyn said gently. Legally protected, with the full weight of the community behind you. The laws have changed, Elena. A woman's right to leave an abusive marriage, to seek safety. These things are recognized now in ways they weren't before. Going public doesn't mean exposing you to danger. It means we can defend you through the law instead of just through walls. And what about the rest of us? Marcus asked. Those of us with histories that don't fit neatly into legal categories? We protect each other. Caleb's voice was firm. That's what we've always done. That's what we'll keep doing. The question isn't whether we protect the community. The question is how. Through secrecy that becomes harder to maintain every year, or through legitimate standing that gives us the power to fight in the open. The debate continued for hours, voices rising and falling, concerns aired and addressed, fears acknowledged, and plans proposed to mitigate them. Through it all, Evelyn watched the community she had come to love wrestling with the same question she and Caleb had been facing, whether to trust that the world had changed enough to let them emerge from the shadows. In the end, the vote was nearly unanimous. They would go public. The process of legitimizing the valley's claims took almost a year, a complicated dance of legal filings, political maneuvering, and carefully managed publicity. Martin Crane at the Herald played a crucial role, publishing a series of articles about the remarkable Rowan operation that framed their story as one of conservation and community rather than deception and evasion. Politicians who had been quietly receiving Caleb's support for years stepped forward to advocate for the corrective filing process. Even Charles Whitmore, whose own interests were served by having a legitimate partner, used his influence to smooth the path. The old fraudulent claims were acknowledged, explained as the necessary survival tactics of a different era. The years of sustainable development, community building, and responsible stewardship were documented and presented as evidence of good faith. One by one, the legal obstacles fell away. On a bright spring morning, 3 years after the decision to go public, Caleb and Evelyn stood together in a Denver courthouse, receiving the final judgment that recognized their legitimate ownership of the valley and all its resources. "It's done," Caleb said, staring at the official document in his hands. "After everything, all the hiding, all the false names, all the years of looking over our shoulder, it's finally done." "No." Evelyn took his arm, turning him to face her. "This isn't an ending, Caleb. It's a beginning. Everything we've built, everything we've protected, now it can grow. Openly. Freely. Without fear." They celebrated that night in the valley, a community gathering that spilled from the main house into the meadows, with bonfires and music and the kind of unrestrained joy that only comes when a long-carried burden is finally set down. Maggie, 8 years old now, and wise beyond her years, danced with the other children under stars that had watched over the valley through all its hidden years. "What happens now?" she asked her mother, breathless from spinning, when the celebration finally wound down. Evelyn knelt to look into her daughter's gray eyes, so like her father's, so full of the sharp intelligence that had become the family inheritance. "Now we build, sweetheart, not in secret anymore, in the open, where everyone can see. We show the world what's possible when people work together, take care of the land, create something meant to last. Will it be dangerous, going public? Maybe sometimes, but hiding was dangerous too. At least now we can face whatever comes standing straight, without pretending to be something we're not. Maggie considered this with the seriousness that characterized all her considerations. I think that's better, she said finally. I didn't like the secrets. I didn't like not being able to tell my friends where I lived. You can tell them now. You can tell everyone. Good. Maggie smiled, the brilliant, transformative smile that had been lighting up the valley since she was born. I want everyone to know about our home. I want them to see how beautiful it is. The years that followed were years of growth and change, challenge and triumph. The railroad came, as promised, its iron tracks cutting through the northern passes just 30 miles from the valley. But instead of threatening what Caleb and Evelyn had built, it connected them to markets, to allies, to a wider world that was increasingly interested in the Rowan approach to resource management. Visitors began arriving, journalists, politicians, businessmen, even a delegation from the newly formed Forest Reserve System who wanted to understand how sustainable harvesting actually worked in practice. Evelyn guided many of these tours personally, explaining the rotation system that ensured forests regenerated faster than they were cut, the water management techniques that kept streams healthy, the community structures that gave workers genuine stakes in the operation's success. You've created a model, one federal official told her, genuine admiration in his voice. What you've done here, it could be replicated across the entire Western timber industry, if the political will existed. Then let's create the political will, Evelyn replied. And she set about doing exactly that. Her network of allies, built over years of careful cultivation, became the foundation for a broader advocacy effort. She testified before territorial legislatures, wrote articles for national publications, corresponded with conservation advocates throughout the country. The Herald series about the Rowan operation was reprinted in newspapers from San Francisco to New York. The hidden valley that had once existed only in rumors became a symbol of what responsible development could look like. You're becoming famous, Caleb observed one evening, watching her prepare for yet another speaking engagement in Denver. The woman who tamed the timber barons. I haven't tamed anyone. Evelyn adjusted her traveling clothes, the practical dress of a businesswoman rather than the fashionable frippery that Eastern visitors expected. I've just shown people what's possible. What they do with that information is up to them. Still, it's a long way from the girl counting fence posts in Ridgecrest. Evelyn paused, meeting his eyes in the mirror. That girl is still here. She's the one who remembers what it felt like to have nothing, to watch everything you love being taken away. She's the reason I keep fighting. She traveled more frequently now, to Denver, to Washington, to conferences and legislative sessions where her voice could make a difference. But she always came home, always returned to the valley, to Caleb, to Maggie, and the community they had built together. Maggie grew into a young woman as remarkable as everyone had predicted. She had her mother's fierce intelligence and her father's patient determination, combined with a natural leadership ability that drew people to her. By 16, she was helping to manage aspects of the operation that would have challenged adults twice her age. By 18, she had ideas for expansion and improvement that went beyond anything her parents had imagined. We could establish a training program, she proposed one evening, spreading her own carefully drawn plans across the study desk. Bring in young people from other regions, teach them our methods, send them back to implement sustainable practices in their own communities. That would take resources, Caleb pointed out. Money, time, facilities. We have resources, and more importantly, we have something worth teaching. Maggie's gray eyes blazed with conviction. Father, Mother, you didn't build all this just for us. You built it to prove something was possible. If we don't share that knowledge, what was the point? Evelyn looked at her daughter, this fierce, brilliant young woman who had never known the desperation and fear that had shaped her parents' early lives, and felt her heart swell with pride. She's right, Evelyn said quietly. We've been building something meant to last. But lasting means spreading, taking root in other places, other communities. If we keep everything contained here in the valley, it dies with us. Caleb was quiet for a long moment, studying his daughter's plans with the careful attention he gave to everything important. Then, slowly, he nodded. Draw up a formal proposal, he told Maggie. Budget, timeline, curriculum. Present it to me when it's ready. Maggie's face lit up. You mean it? I mean it. He reached out to touch her cheek, a gesture of tenderness that still, after all these years, came awkwardly to a man who had spent so long guarding his emotions. You're the future of everything we've built, Margaret. It's time you started shaping it. The Rowan Institute for Sustainable Forestry, Maggie's dream made real, opened its doors 2 years later. Students came from across the country, eager to learn the methods that had made the valley famous. They studied silviculture and watershed management, community governance, and cooperative economics. They worked alongside the valley's residents, learning not just techniques but values. The understanding that land was not a resource to be exploited but a trust to be managed for future generations. You've done something remarkable, Charles Whitmore said, visiting the institute in its 3rd year of operation. He was an old man now, white-haired and slower than he had been, but his eyes still held the sharp intelligence that had made him Ashworth's most trusted lieutenant and eventually his successor. Victor would have hated it, you know. Everything about this, the openness, the teaching, the sharing of knowledge. He believed power came from hoarding information, not spreading it. Victor Ashworth was wrong about a lot of things, Evelyn replied. They were walking through the Institute's demonstration forest, where students practiced the selective harvesting techniques that had become the valley's signature. He built an empire, yes, but what happened to it after he died? Fragmented, fought over, most of it sold off to pay his heirs' debts. In 50 years, no one will remember Victor Ashworth. And the Rowans? In 50 years, the methods we've developed here will be standard practice throughout the West. The forests will be healthier because of what we've taught. The communities will be stronger. The land will still be producing timber for generations not yet born. Evelyn smiled slightly. That's the legacy I want. Not a monument to ourselves, but a better world because we existed. Whitmore was quiet for a long moment, considering this. You really believe that's possible? That one family, one valley, can change how an entire industry operates? I believe in beginnings, Evelyn said. Every change starts somewhere. Every movement begins with someone who refused to accept that things had to stay the way they were. She looked out over the forest, her home, the place where she had transformed from a desperate girl into something she never imagined. We planted seeds here, Charles. Not just trees, but ideas. What grows from them? That's not up to us anymore. The changes came gradually, as changes always do. Not in dramatic revolutionary sweeps, but in the steady accumulation of small victories. A territorial law here requiring sustainable practices on public lands. A federal regulation there incorporating methods developed at the Rowan Institute. A generation of foresters trained in the valley spreading out across the country, carrying their knowledge into forests from Maine to California. Evelyn watched it all unfold with a satisfaction that ran deeper than pride. She had come to this valley with nothing but desperation and a willingness to survive. She would leave it, someday, not yet, but someday, having helped reshape how humanity thought about its relationship with the land. On a golden afternoon in late September, 20 years after she had first ridden through those hidden passes as a stranger and a bride, Evelyn sat on the porch of the main house watching the valley she had helped build stretch away toward mountains that still guarded its secrets. Though those secrets were different now than they had been. The cutting crews were working the north slopes, following rotation schedules that would ensure those trees' grandchildren would also be harvested, generations hence. The mill wheel turned steadily by the river, as it had for 30 years. Students from the Institute walked the demonstration trails, notebooks in hand, learning lessons that would shape forests they had never seen. Caleb settled into the chair beside her, his hair gray now, his face weathered by decades of mountain sun and wind. But his eyes were the same, those pale gray eyes that had watched her across a muddy street in a dying settlement, seeing something in her that she hadn't yet seen in herself. Maggie's proposal for the Second Institute came through, he said, handing her a thick packet of papers. She wants to establish it in Oregon, says the timber industry there is ready for change. Evelyn took the proposal, not opening it yet, just holding it, the weight of their daughter's ambition, their family's legacy, in her hands. She's going to outpace both of us, isn't she? She already has. There was no sadness in Caleb's voice, only pride. We built the foundation. She's building the cathedral. Mixing metaphors. I'm allowed. I'm old. Evelyn laughed. The same surprised, joyful sound that had first escaped her that night on this very porch, when Caleb had admitted he was falling in love with her. So much had changed since then. So much had stayed the same. Do you ever think about it? She asked. The beginning. That day in Ridgecrest when you made me your impossible offer. Every day. He reached over and took her hand, the same hand he had placed a wedding ring on in a cramped parlor while a circuit judge mumbled words neither of them had really heard. I think about the woman you were, the woman you've become, the life we've built together. Any regrets? Not one. He lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss against her fingers. You're the best decision I ever made, Evelyn Rowan, the best risk I ever took. Funny. I was just thinking the same thing about you. They sat together in the golden light, watching shadows lengthen across the valley floor. Somewhere below, children laughed. Institute students probably, or perhaps the grandchildren of workers who had been here since the beginning. The sound drifted up like music, like promise, like proof that what they had built would outlast them. I used to be afraid, Evelyn said quietly. All the time. Afraid of losing what we had. Afraid of being discovered, afraid of the enemies at the gates. I don't remember when I stopped being afraid. Maybe when you realized there wasn't anything left to fear. We've faced everything, Ashworth, the exposure, the railroad, all of it. And we're still here. We're still here. She squeezed his hand. Together. The sun touched the western ridges, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose. In the distance, an eagle circled over the forest they had spent their lives protecting. The world beyond the valley continued to change. New technologies, new challenges, new battles to be fought by new generations. But in this moment, on this porch, with this man beside her, Evelyn felt something she had searched for her entire life without knowing its name. Peace. Not the peace of giving up or settling for less, but the peace that came from knowing she had given everything she had to something worth building. She had walked into this valley as a bride of convenience, a transaction in human form, a woman who had sold herself for survival. She was leaving it, not yet, but someday, as a wife, a mother, a leader, a teacher, as someone who had taken the impossible circumstances of her life and transformed them into something beautiful. The girl who had counted fence posts while hope faded had become a woman who had changed the world. Not in the ways she once imagined, back when she dreamed of teaching in fine schools, or marrying for love, or living a life of comfortable respectability, but in ways that mattered more, ways that would ripple outward through time, touching lives she would never know, shaping a future she would never see. That was the real legacy. Not the valley itself, not the timber empire, not even the institute that bore their name, but the idea that had driven everything else, the belief that it was possible to build something sustainable, something fair, something that took care of the land instead of stripping it bare. That belief would survive them. That belief would grow and spread and take root in places they had never imagined. Evelyn looked at her husband, at the mountains, at the valley spread out below them in the dying light of another day. She thought about the journey that had brought her here, the desperate choice, the hidden empire, the battles fought and won, the love that had grown from the most unlikely soil. I'm glad, she said simply. Caleb turned to look at her. Glad? For all of it, the fear and the struggle and the impossible odds, because it brought me here. It made me who I am. It gave me you and Maggie and this life I never could have imagined. Even the hard parts? Especially the hard parts. She smiled at him, her husband, her partner, the shabby stranger who had offered her survival and given her so much more. They're what made everything else possible. The last light faded from the sky, leaving stars to keep watch over the valley as they had for countless ages before humans ever walked these mountains, as they would for countless ages after. In the houses scattered across the settlement, lamps were being lit, families gathering for evening meals. Another day ending in the community they had all built together. And on the porch of the main house, Evelyn Rowan sat with her hand in her husband's, at peace with everything she had been and everything she had become. She had married survival. She had found love. She had built a legacy. And she had done it all on her own terms, in her own way, with her own fierce and uncompromising determination. The girl from Ridgecrest had become something extraordinary, and the story she had written with her life would echo through generations yet to come.